On a bleak morning in Maine's silent bay, with the sea as still as time itself, old Liam sat motionless on his weathered boat. No direction, no reason left to live. Then, from the heart of that hopeless stillness, a shadow emerged. A German shepherd, battered, bloodied, barely afloat, yet with eyes burning like it had swum straight out of hell. It didn't bark, didn't beg. It just looked at him, as if he was its last chance. What could drive a dying dog to cross an ocean just to reach a stranger? The sky was painted in a hushed shade of ash, not quite gray, not quite blue, but that in-between hue of memories not yet faded, like a breath held too long, suspended above a sea so still that it ceased to be water and became instead a mirror stretched endlessly between this world and something just beyond reach, something the human eye, dulled by grief and time, could no longer pierce through. Liam Cole sat at the bow of the old wooden boat named the Mariner's Sleep, the same boat he had repainted himself in the days after his wife's funeral, not to venture into the deep, but to keep from crumbling apart. And though the new paint clung to the hull in earnest coats, it could not hide the warped timber beneath, nor mask the scratches that time and tide had long ago carved into its skin, just as no surface of calm ever truly hides the weight of sorrow beneath it. He no longer fished. Not for food, not for sport, not even for memory. Each morning, he left the dock while the town still slept, not to earn a living, nor to track the weather as he had once done in his days as a senior sea rescue officer, but only to drift into the middle of the bay, where the water lay so quiet it felt like the final pool of tears that had dried on a face too long untouched. The boat moved slowly, without aim, without urgency, without the push of wind or the pull of tides, just the faint thump of a heart that still beat, and the soft creak of planks beneath boots that had known too many goodbyes. The silence was not unsettling, for it matched the man exactly, as if the world had forgotten his name and, in response, he had slowly allowed himself to forget it too. Once upon a time, Liam had been known as the man who never let anyone drown, 30 years in open waters, pulling strangers back from the edge. But now, the one in danger of slipping beneath the surface was himself, and the sea, vast and indifferent, did not know how to swim back for anyone. From the breast pocket of his coat, he pulled out a pocket watch, its hands frozen since the moment Marie had taken her last breath. 2:11 in the afternoon. No one asked why he hadn't replaced the battery, just as no one asked anything of him anymore. Like the boat he drifted on, he had become an artifact of a time no longer spoken of, a name no longer called out. The Maine coast in December offered no violence, but it offered no warmth either. It existed in a kind of suspended cruelty, not wild enough to kill, yet not soft enough to let a man feel alive. It was this cold, settled like mist in the bones, that Liam found himself dissolving into. He cast a line with no bait, not in the hope of catching anything, but simply because the motion felt familiar, like knocking each night on a door that led to an empty room, not out of hope, but out of habit. He watched the float drift outward into the stillness, then dropped his gaze to the water, a surface so flat it returned a reflection he barely recognized anymore. Eyes carved deep from silence, hair in loose defeat, wrinkles like shallow cuts from knives long put away. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, not to shut out the pale sky, but to feel. A habit born from years on the ocean, where listening and instinct often carried more truth than sight ever could. The wood creaked. The water lapped gently against the hull. And then, in the midst of these familiar sounds, there was a pause. Brief, almost imperceptible, but different. A small shift in the breath of the world that caused his eyes to open, not in alarm, but in attention, as if something unseen had moved one beat out of rhythm. Liam sat up, resting a hand on the edge of the boat, scanning the horizon. Nothing was visibly wrong. Nothing stirred. The sea lay open like a blank page awaiting its first word. But inside him, something had shifted. Not the alertness of a man trained to spot distress, but the raw, uncertain instinct of someone who had lost too much not to notice when something in the silence changes. And so he stayed still, breath quiet, gaze steady, waiting to see what would rise from the unwritten line between sky and sea. The water remained motionless, offering no hint, no ripple. But at that exact place where the faded sky met the ashen sea, something began to move. Slowly, without panic, without randomness, moving in a way that suggested purpose too heavy to explain. Liam saw it clearly. A large, dark form swimming toward him, not slicing the surface with urgency, but pushing through it with a rhythm that spoke not of strength, but of will. A will that had refused to surrender, that pressed forward even when every inch of its body seemed ready to give in. He squinted, fingers tightening slightly around the wooden edge. It wasn't a whale, it wasn't a dolphin, it wasn't the drifting shadow of a drowned man. It was a shape, deliberate, unwavering, cutting through the water in a straight line toward the boat, as if it knew exactly where it needed to go. Or perhaps it had gambled everything it had left on this one final attempt to arrive. The wind didn't rise, but the air had changed. The salt smelled sharper now, thicker. There was something else in it. Faint, metallic, like the scent of blood dissolving into mist, like a subtle fracture splintering across the senses. And then the shape became clearer. A head emerged, long, slender, ears rigid and upright. No silver gleam of a fin, no frothy burst of hunting fish. Just a neck arching above the surface, trembling with each clenched contraction of effort, and the eyes. Those eyes, wide, clouded with salt, yet still holding a gaze so unwavering that it clutched at his chest with invisible fingers. It was a dog, not just any dog, but a full-grown male German shepherd, large, muscular, noble in build, but brought to the very edge of ruin. Its fur clung in soaked patches to its skin, mottled in shades of gray and scorched brown beneath the pale sun. The sea reached its neck, and with every rear leg kick, its body convulsed, as if life itself was being wrung out of every joint, every tendon, every inch of bone. It did not whimper, it did not bark, it did not glide like a creature built for the hunt. It swam like something dragging a great invisible weight behind it. Every thrust was compressed anguish. This wasn't swimming to conquer waves. It was swimming not to sink in that very moment. Liam stood frozen. Since the day he left the service, he had never seen anything quite like this. A four-legged being, without wings, without fins, alone in the open sea, like something cast out from the world it belonged to, and dropped into a realm where its very existence made no sense. And yet it swam toward him, never once straying off course, never once hesitating. There was only a quiet, near-desperate resolve in those eyes that had not looked away from him for even a second, as though the entire ocean had vanished, and only this boat remained real, and the man on it, somehow, was the last remaining chance. His heart contracted. Not out of fear, not out of instinctive caution, but because he had seen that look before, in the final hours of a wife fading away, breath by breath, unable to form words, but her eyes still clinging to him with a question too cruel to speak aloud. Will I be left behind? And now, in those salt-burned eyes of a speechless, pleading creature, that same question surfaced again, wordless but unmistakable. Liam rose, stepping slowly to the side of the boat, to the place where the shadow was drawing closer. Each step rang softly on the damp wooden deck. He did not call. He did not wave. He said nothing at all. He merely stood, like an anchor point between two worlds. The dog was nearer now. Only a few meters remained. He could see it clearly now, the pale blood soaking the fur on its chest, a gash slicing across its flank like a mark left by metal or a jagged hook. Its eyes still locked on his, unblinking. One front leg lifted from the water, twitching towards the air as if to find something to hold, only to fall again because there was nothing. This swim was not a journey toward somewhere. It was a return, toward someone it had never met, never named, but by some raw, unreachable instinct had chosen to believe in. And then, just as its head neared the boat's hull, it tried once more, raising a paw and placing it, at last, upon the edge of the weathered wood. Not thrashing, not whining, not begging, just placing it there. Trembling, waterlogged, reeking of ocean and pain, as if asking permission to stay. Liam did not move. His body had gone cold, not from wind, but from the clear, piercing knowledge that this moment would change every moment that followed. Some encounters are not arranged. Some souls drift across the sea of life, nameless, placeless, but find one another through the quietest of echoes. And he stood there, before a creature worn down, alone, and inexplicably beautiful in its desolation, as if the universe had, in secret, chosen him to be the final harbor. It did not bark. It did not whine. It did not howl like a beast tasting death. It simply swam, each kick of its thin limbs compressing the silence of screams long since drowned. Its head now touched the edge of the boat, forelegs reaching for the warped wood, claws scraping lightly against the deck. Not to cling, but as if to ask gently, without intrusion, "I made it this far. I ask for nothing more, only that you do not look away." Liam looked down, not at a strange animal, but at something long lost, something that had drifted away from him long ago and now returned in a broken body, soaked, scarred, but still holding an eye that did not beg for pity, but sought only someone willing to look back and not flinch. Those eyes, burned by salt, dulled by the sea, hollowed by time, flickered with a hope so fragile that, had he not been watching closely, he might have mistaken it for nothing more than the glint of sunlight dancing on the waves. But Liam did not look away. He saw it, that flicker of light, not the kind that shines, but the kind that lingers like the final ember in a house swallowed by a winter blackout, the kind that burns quietly when everything else has already surrendered. And he understood. This dog was no longer swimming to survive. It was swimming toward the one place where even a battered creature might still be seen as something that was never meant to be discarded. He leaned forward, not to reach, not to call out, not to offer words, but simply to lean, the way one might bow before something far too vast to grasp with action, too fragile to be touched by hands, and too sacred to measure with reason. The wind stirred, faint and reluctant, not strong enough to lift a strand of his graying hair, yet enough to carry the raw scent of soaked fur steeped too long in salt, the sharp tang of fresh blood rising from a wound too deep to close, the unmistakable scent of a living being who had once had purpose, once had people, once had a name, and now had only this left: to swim, perhaps one last time. Liam did not fully remember how he moved. He only knew that his hands, by reflex or fate, had found the old storage hatch, pulled out the coil of rope he'd kept intact out of habit from a life once dedicated to rescue. Those hands, once strong enough to haul men from drowning waves, now trembled, not from age, but from the weight of something he wasn't sure he was worthy to hold. He did not shift his stance. His entire body had gone cold, not from the air, but from the clear knowledge that this moment, fragile and unnamed, would change the rest of his life in a way no storm ever had. Some encounters are not arranged by time nor place, but by the silent vibrations of souls adrift, souls with no label, no belonging, who find one another not by noise, but by need. And he stood there, before a creature so utterly spent, so alone, yet so beautiful in its inexplicable resilience, that it felt as though the universe itself had chosen Liam to become the final harbor. The dog swam closer, its strokes no longer rhythmic, but like the stubborn convulsions of a body exceeding the limits even instinct had set. Its figure, broad and heavy, weighed down by salt-soaked fur, moved through the water as if each pull forward cost something sacred. Reddish streaks drifted faintly through the sea, not enough to bleed, but enough to know that beneath the drenched coat was torn flesh, was pain without pause, was a story carved in silence and scar. It did not howl, did not thrash, did not plead. Each stroke was an act of releasing everything that had come before. Each glance upward was a gamble. And in those eyes that Liam could not look away from, could not retreat from, could not pretend not to see, was a wordless plea from a being who had once been trusted, once been named, once been loved, and was now little more than a hollowed soul clinging to the belief that maybe, just maybe, something was still left to reach for. That gaze held no blame, no bitterness, only a quiet wetness, not from the sea, but from something much older, much deeper, like a memory severed mid-sentence. It looked at him as if to ask, "Will I be allowed to stay this time?" And Liam stood frozen, not in fear, not in uncertainty, but because, in all his years on earth, he had never seen a look like that. The look of one who had lost everything, who had nothing left to shield, nowhere left to return, and yet still chose to offer the last flicker of self to a stranger, hoping for an answer. The dog raised a paw to the edge of the boat, claws slipping against damp wood. A wave surged, splashing Liam's legs. But he did not move. He did not flinch. He did not bend to assist. He stood there, motionless, overwhelmed by the silence that encircled them, man and dog, like time itself had paused, stepped aside, and made room for a moment too real for language. No one called out. No sound was made. No touch was exchanged. Only that gaze. Steady, weary, aching, but unyielding. And Liam knew it was not the eyes of the body before him that held him there, but something that came from far deeper, far older, a place where once loved souls are cast out, abandoned, and still, somehow, still believed that there might be one last time, one more moment, one final chance not to fade into nothingness. He drew in a long breath, not to steady himself, but to mark this instant into the very tissue of his being, into his blood, into the pulse of his lungs, the moment when a soul that had sunk to the ocean floor of life somehow swam through the weight of loss and found its way to him, not with demand, but with a question too sacred to ignore. No need for touch, no need for words, no need for promises, just a need for him to stay. The dog tried again. Its eyes never left his. Its chest rose in a shudder. Muscles trembled under salt and memory. The smell of blood now mingled with wet wood, with sea breeze, with flesh steeped in brine. But the eyes, those eyes, remained unchanged, unbroken, unblurred. They did not dim. They held him, not with ropes, not with voice, but with the aching clarity of a being who, across the whole expanse of sea, of loneliness, of loss, had chosen him as the one thing still real. And Liam, with a heart still stitched shut, with hands that had not opened again since the day Marie died, stood there, tethered not by force, but by a look that reached into the deepest part of him he had so carefully hidden away. Slowly, he bent down, opening the narrow wood panel on the side of the cockpit, the one that still held an old coil of rope he had nearly discarded, only to keep. Like one might keep a broken memory, not for use, but because cutting it loose felt too much like giving up. The rope was heavy, worn, still scented faintly of menthol from its last outing. The ends were frayed, hardened by time. He tied one end into a fixed loop, looped it through the rusted steel railing, and let it drop quietly toward the water. Not speaking, not signaling, just offering it as a silent bridge between two worlds, one still anchored and one still struggling not to sink. The dog followed the movement with its eyes, head tilting ever so slightly, a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed, if not for the stillness that surrounded it. Its body swayed gently with the water, shoulders and neck weighed down by tufts of fur matted thick with salt and blood, the darker streaks already beginning to dry, crusted along its wounds. Its eyes, no longer gleaming but clouded with brine, did not waver, not in restlessness, not in despair, and not in surrender. Liam lowered himself to the edge of the boat, gripping the rope in his weathered hands, gaze cast downward, not like a man preparing to save, but like someone ready to bear witness to something greater than himself, something sacred, something quiet and vast and irreversibly real. No one called, no one commanded, no one led the way. There was only a rope, a gaze, an arm waiting. And then it began. The dog lifted one front leg, not with haste, not with ritual, but with something deeper, more primal, more instinct than decision, as if everything left inside it, everything it still was, had gathered into that one motion. Its paw brushed the rope. Once it slipped. Twice it found a rhythm. The third time it held. Its chest expanded, rising above the surface, and with a push heavy enough to make the wood creak, the line pulled taut. Liam held his balance with both feet braced, eyes fixed, unmoving. The dog kicked with its hind legs, not forcefully, but with conviction, raising its body from the sea like something dense and fading being pulled back to life. Each breath it exhaled came out in clouds against the damp, cold air. Each strain of its shoulders brought a fresh bloom of blood from the torn flesh beneath its ribs. Each climb on the rope was not merely a physical ascent, but a journey backward, through memory, through terror, through the place it had once been left behind, where it was not allowed to turn back. And Liam, who had never imagined himself reaching out again, held the rope with trembling hands, not from exhaustion, but because he was witnessing something raw and relentless, a life that refused to die, a loyalty that would not dissolve, and a faith that would not vanish. Its body touched the deck. A dry, heavy thud rang out. It pushed forward one last time, one foreleg pressed fully onto the wooden plank, its form teetering, lurching, and then, with one final heave of its shoulder, not calculated, not rehearsed, not guided by technique, but driven only by the stubborn momentum of something with no other way left, it climbed. And then it lay there, on the deck, soaked, heavy, long, no sound, no motion. Only breath, shallow and deep, strong and failing, lengthening, then collapsing again. Salt mingled with blood. Blood ran down into the grooves of the deck. The scent of iron mixed with wind, seeping into skin, into hair, into every crevice of the hands that had just released the rope. Liam sat down. He did not touch it. He did not speak its name. He only sat, as one might before a grave newly exposed after a landslide, relieved to have found it, and aching because it was still alive. The dog did not open its eyes, but it still breathed. Its chest still rose and fell, its ears still flicked faintly. One front paw curled slightly inward, as if holding close the void between itself and the world. And in that moment, on a lonely boat, in the middle of a cold ocean, with no witnesses, no applause, no one to call this a miracle, Liam understood he had made a choice. Not the choice to save something, but the choice not to look away. Not every time you reach out does it lead to something sweet. Not every act of trust is returned. But there are some creatures, when they drag themselves across oceans, against instinct, beyond fear, just to reach someone, then the one who receives them must have the courage not to turn away. And today, Liam had chosen that. Not every time you reach out does it lead to something sweet. Not every act of trust is returned. But there are some creatures, when they drag themselves across oceans, against instinct, beyond fear, just to reach someone, then the one who receives them must have the courage not to turn away. And today, Liam had chosen that. He sat beside the dog, not in the sea anymore, no longer suspended between life and forgetting, but lying here now, on the deck of the boat, breathing in rattled, uneven bursts like an old engine stalling, but still pushing for one last turn. The breath was broken, but present. Its chest still heaved. Its ears still twitched against the cutting breeze drifting across the wooden planks. Its fur was soaked, plastered to its frame. Salt had dried into pale flakes along its back and neck. And blood, from a long gash down its side, continued to seep in silent droplets. Liam reached for a small wooden crate beside the cabin, pulling from it an old towel and a bottle of fresh water, the kind he always brought along on trips to the bay, not because he needed it, but out of a leftover habit from the days he still lived by survival rules. He did not press hard, only wiped gently along the fur near its shoulder, each pass of the cloth slow, cautious, as though fearing he might tear something too delicate to hold. The animal's skin was burning, not with vitality, but with the fever that had begun to creep along its veins, silent but fierce. There was the scent of singed fur, of metallic blood, of skin left wet too long, familiar yet haunting, like the scent of a grief buried so deep that touching it felt like brushing against something sacred and half-forgotten. Liam wiped gently up its neck. His hand stopped, just behind the left ear, beneath fur parted by water and heat. There was a faint mark, almost lost to time. Ink. Not a circle, not a square, not beautiful, but unmistakable to anyone who had once belonged to the world Liam had walked away from so many years ago. The letters, K 9 point. Pressed into the skin, faded, blurred at the edges, like something worn down by time, but still there, refusing to vanish. Liam held his breath. His fingers paused, then rested softly against the mark, not to verify but to feel it, to remember something that had once been part of him, now returned in a form he could never have imagined. A working dog. Not a house pet, not a stray, not lost, not nameless, but a soldier, a veteran, a member of a unit once trained, once counted, once part of an order, of duty, of discipline, of dignity, and of the right to be remembered. And now, lying here in the middle of the sea, without anyone knowing, without any tracker, without any signal or recall order, completely alone. Liam took half a step back. Inside his head, a sound rose. Not the sound of the sea, but the pounding rhythm of a heart caught in the undertow between memory and reality. He had seen dogs like this before, not in books, not on television, but with his own eyes, his own hands. He had once knelt beside them before deployment, had once listened to the sound of their paws tapping in cadence across the concrete during cargo inspections, had once witnessed the way they stood watch beside a fallen handler in the desert, unmoving, unfed, unblinking, lying there, waiting for a command that would never come again. And now, he stood before one of them once more. No idea where it had come from, no way of knowing how long it had swum to get here. No explanation for how it had been cast adrift in this bitter sea. No life raft, no handler, no voice calling it back. But if this dog had truly been in service, then who had allowed such a creature to vanish without a trace? Liam crouched, gently parting the fur near its shoulder. No identification chip, no serial tag, no collar, no signal of ownership from the human world it once belonged to. Only flesh, claw marks, dried blood, faded ink, and silence. He sat down, his back against the pilot cabin, eyes lifting toward the sky. The afternoon light had begun to tilt, not sharp anymore, not blue, just that soft, tired hue before dusk, where everything slows but nothing truly ends. The sea still mirrored like glass, but now, reflected in it, was something else. Not just a man trying to outrun his grief, but a man who had just been handed a question with no voice, no sender, only a faint marking behind one ear. And he understood that whoever had etched those symbols into this living body, no matter what purpose they once served, had forfeited something that not everyone is ever lucky enough to receive again. The trust of a K9, not born from commands or conditioning, but from something no manual can teach, unconditional loyalty. Salt wind swept across the deck. Particles rose and clung to hair, to skin, to eyes. Liam closed his eyes, not to stop the tears from falling, but so they wouldn't fall so plainly. Not from pain, not from guilt, but because too many things in life had been erased, suddenly returning now, not in sound, not in vision, but in the shape of an old ink mark lying silent behind an ear. The dog had not opened its eyes, but it was no longer nameless, no longer just a drifting shadow in the ocean. It was something that once had a place. And within Liam, a question surfaced, one not meant for the past and not in need of an immediate answer. How could a creature so strictly trained, so closely guarded as military property, end up on a solitary journey, swimming through the open sea? That question, heavy as stone, opened the door to another, deeper, more troubling, impossible to ignore. If it made it here, then what happened behind it? Liam placed his hand gently on the dog's soaked fur, sliding down toward its chest. The coat was thicker here, harder to see through, but as his fingers passed across the belly, he felt a patch of skin softer, wrinkled strangely, and something cold surged up his spine. He pressed lightly. The dog flinched. Not a growl, not a fight, just a reflexive tightening of muscle, the kind that comes from creatures too used to pain to bother crying out anymore. Liam tilted the dog slightly to one side, reached for the flashlight from the deck, and shone it upward, the beam cutting through the shadows. And he saw it, a cut, not fresh but not healed, jagged edges, uneven skin, bruised flesh, a wound made in haste, without anesthesia, without sanitation, without care, a patch of tissue missing, small, precise, the exact size of a standard military identification chip. Liam needed no further guesswork. This wasn't a stray, wasn't an accident, wasn't a mistake. Someone, deliberately, had removed this dog from the system. No transfer, no report. No trace left to track where it had served. Not abandoned. Erased. He collapsed into a crouch, one hand still on the slowly bleeding belly, the other gripping a corner of cloth now soaked deeper red with each passing second. He had seen military retire K9 units before, had watched them return to care centers, had listened to promises of post-service protection, but he had also heard the whispered stories in quiet corridors of nameless missions, code void units, dogs with no serial numbers, and the chilling rumors of those who no longer officially existed. He had never imagined he would one day touch one of them with his own hands. A living creature that once bore a name, a purpose, a belief in the human it followed, then ripped from all systems, erased from all lists, cast into the ocean, as if it had never been born to serve. Liam pulled gauze from the emergency kit, rubbed it roughly across his own palms to stay awake, not from fatigue, but from a quiet fury now rising like tidewater breaching a dam. A fury not directed at any one face, but at the very machine that could manufacture such perfect beings, then quietly destroy them when they no longer served. The dog stirred. Its eyes opened, not wide, not sharp, not bright. But they looked. And in the light of the flashlight, that gaze broke again, not into questions, not into longing, but into something heavier. Endurance. The kind of endurance that belongs to those who have learned, again and again, that no one is coming. It did not breathe hard, did not cry, did not plead. It merely let him see that it knew it was being examined. And it stayed still, not out of trust, but because it had nothing else left to do. And in that surrender, not hopeless, but hollow, Liam felt a pain more cutting than blood, more unbearable than any wound, more haunting than the blurred marking behind its ear. He placed both hands on the wooden deck, close to the creature's head, not touching, just letting it know he was still there, still present, still a witness in the silence between each breath. The wind slipped through the gap between the sails. The waves began to find rhythm. And in that rhythm, a thought came. Quiet, but sharp. If the wounds on its body were already so clear, so brutally visible, then how many more lay hidden beneath the skin, buried deep in the places where no hand could reach and no voice could name? How many nights had it gone without sleep? How many times had it kept moving when there was no one left to move for? How many explosions had it run through? How many times had it crossed that razor's edge between life and death, only to be discarded like expired cargo the moment no one needed it anymore? And perhaps the most devastating thing of all was that it still swam, still moved toward the human world, still chose to believe. Despite every sign, every memory, every silent betrayal that should have taught it otherwise, Liam remained where he was, for a long time, not moving, not thinking, just feeling. Feeling each breath echo against his chest, each pulse of blood soaking the towel in his hands, each subtle tightening of the dog's muscles, not in defense, not in pain, but in that quiet, feral refusal to surrender. After a while, he reached for the old medical kit, retrieved the last vial of antiseptic, and began wrapping the wound. Slowly, carefully, not out of an effort to appear gentle, but because for the first time in a very long time, he was truly afraid of causing pain. Because for the first time, he understood. It was not the pain of flesh torn open that nearly ended this creature. It was the pain of being erased, of being unnamed, and he swore to himself, silently and absolutely, that no one, not even a dog, should ever have to feel that again. Sometime later, he opened the weathered first aid cabinet again, retrieved the final strip of bandage, and tightened it around the wound. Slow, precise, each movement weighted not with skill, but with the kind of fear that came from caring too much. Because he finally understood. It wasn't physical pain that almost killed this animal. It was the ache of being forgotten, erased, unseen, and no living being, no matter how many legs it walked on, deserved to feel that weight again. Liam sat silently near the edge of the boat, hands still holding the last strip of gauze, not yet fastened, his eyes locked on the horizon that was slowly bleeding into ash. The light overhead had grown weary, not golden enough to be dusk, not dark enough to be night, but caught in between. A tired kind of gray that seemed to echo the fatigue buried deep inside him. The wind thickened, not violent, not wild, but enough to make the sails shudder, enough for the anchor post to begin its soft, rhythmic groaning. Liam stood, stepped quietly into the cabin, and reached for the old radio he still brought on every trip, even though it had stopped working properly months ago. He flipped the switch. White noise crackled into the space, a cascade of static waves, hissing like rain against a screen with no picture, a language of ghosts whispering through wires. He turned the dial, scanning across a spectrum of frequencies too high for human ears, but his heart strained to catch any hint, any flicker, any fragile click that might suggest a response hiding in the static. No signal, no emergency code, no voice on the other end, only a vacuum of sound so complete it pressed against the lungs, a silence not born of peace, but the heavy quiet that comes when you are completely severed from the rest of the world. Liam placed his hand on the transmitter, thumb holding down the send button, and spoke into the emptiness. "This is fishing vessel, Unit 14, medical emergency. Requesting support. I repeat, medical emergency." His voice cracked. He let go of the button. No answer. He tried again. Twice more. And then, leaning forward, he rested his forehead on the edge of the wheel, eyes closed. Not from hopelessness, but from exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion known only to those who have survived war, not the exhaustion of failing strength, but the deeper fatigue that comes from understanding how silence works. Liam lifted his head. Through the cabin glass, he looked up at a sky that held nothing. No satellites, no lights, no beams piercing the cloud cover. No chopper passing overhead. No one coming. And in that breathless moment, he understood, again, that it was just him and the creature gasping for air on the deck outside. 2 commas, suspended mid-sentence, in a long, unfinished story left behind by the world. He gripped the wheel tighter. The wind shifted. The water was no longer still. The waves rippled with subtle intention, like the ocean had begun tapping out a message on the hull, warning that something was coming. Something not yet visible, but real. There were no more choices left to make. Liam stepped back onto the deck, glanced once at the dog, still lying motionless, breath rapid but steady, tail tucked, as if conserving the last ember of instinct, and turned back into the cabin. He started the engine. The roar came alive, rough, dry, ancient, like a memory that had refused to die. He turned the wheel slowly, steering the bow northeast, toward the last lighthouse post he'd ever served before retiring. There were no more keepers there. No duties, no beacons still lit. Only a jagged tower of stone rising from the sea, battered by wind, hammered by rain, no longer marked on any map worth trusting. But he remembered. The rusted iron stairs, the steel-framed windows long torn from their hinges, the watchroom thick with dust, and the old communication line, archaic, forgotten, but maybe, just maybe, still capable of connecting if he could find the right frequency. No one else knew about that place. No one cared to return. And maybe that was exactly what made it perfect. A place quiet enough to shelter something erased, hidden enough to keep it safe from pursuit. Far enough for Liam to begin understanding what had just entered his life, here, adrift in an ocean that pretended not to care. He gripped the wheel. His eyes never left the horizon. The sea was rising. The rain had begun. But the bow, like the man, did not drift. Because when no one answers from the sky, you find the highest place you can and send the signal yourself. And just far enough far enough for him to begin to understand the weight of what had come into his life, uninvited and unannounced, in the middle of an ocean that had, for so long, felt numb and indifferent. Liam tightened his grip on the tiller, eyes locked straight ahead. The sea had begun to rise, the wind to call, and the rain to fall, but the bow of the boat, like the man himself, did not waver. Because when no answer comes down from the sky, you have to find a high enough place to send out a signal of your own. And when the first flicker of the abandoned tower's beacon broke through the rain curtain, Liam did not feel relief, but something heavier, denser, pressing down upon his chest like the sound of silence returning to a room where no voice had called for days. That hulking gray block of concrete, resting between the black rocks and the silver-streaked surf, welcomed no one, promised nothing, held back nothing. It simply stood there, high and mute, like a witness who had forgotten how to tell the truth of what it once saw. He docked the boat against the half-collapsed pier, secured it by hand because the motorized reel had long since given up. Night had fallen. The rain came down in fine ash-like drops, dissolving the moment they touched the water, leaving no ripple, no trace. The dog still lay motionless on the deck. From the moment the engine had started, it hadn't moved. No growl, no shift, no attempt to rise. Only once, when the boat changed course, did it open its eyes, just barely, then shut them again, turning its head toward the sea. Liam pitched the old canvas tent right there on the deck, draping it over the dog's body to shield it from the night. When he pulled the tarp across its shoulders, it made no sound. But when he sat down beside it, preparing to pull his hand away, a single paw reached out, slow, quiet, intentional, resting on his ankle. Not to hold, not to cling, just to be there, like breath held still enough to become touch. The first night at the old light station passed in undisturbed silence. No crashing waves, no cries for help, just the wind circling the tower, pressing against its concrete shell like an old traveler unwilling to leave. Liam did not sleep. He sat there, back against the railing, eyes fixed on the ocean. The radio crackled faintly beside him, the static like the erratic rhythm of a heart jolted too many times by electric shock. No frequency caught, no voices replied. And still, he remained, like a gatekeeper at the threshold of a place no one intended to return to. Each night, he returned to that posture, not out of duty, not from fear, but because some part of him had come to understand that there are beings in this world who survive only by believing someone will stay awake while they sleep, will keep watch while they finally stop trying, will sit close without asking for anything, simply to anchor their drowning soul to a presence that does not drift away. And he, who had once believed himself to have nothing left to guard, was now quietly relearning what it meant to keep a promise no one had asked him to make, the promise not to leave. The dog never left the deck. Whether rain poured or mist settled heavy across the water, it lay there, head resting on its front legs, eyes barely open, ears twitching at each gust. And every time Liam stood, stepping out of sight, it would lift its head, not barking, not whining, just following him with its gaze and lowering it again only when he returned. As if it, too, were standing watch, not for itself, but for something else, something out there that hadn't come home, or might never come home again. By the third night, Liam began to notice. The dog's eyes were not only tracking him, they stared beyond, far beyond, into the horizon where the light could no longer cut through the fog, but where something still pulled at its attention. As if a voice had once called from there, as if it was waiting, not hoping, not dreaming, just waiting, purely, faithfully in the way only those who have nothing left to lose can still afford. And he understood then. He He was not the only sentinel posted at this forgotten wharf. There were two beings, one man, one dog, sharing the same stretch of time, the same breath of salt air, the same long, drawn-out silence. A silence that did not destroy them, but was instead the very thing that held them together. Each night, Liam placed the broken-legged wooden chair beside the edge of the deck, brought his flask of cold coffee and the signal-less radio, and sat quietly next to the dog. No words, no touch. Just two souls surviving side by side, kept afloat by presence alone. Sometimes he looked at it and wondered. Had it once stood watch for someone else? Had it once waited for a signal? Had it once lain at the feet of another, counting their breath, guarding every twitch, every nighttime movement, every danger not yet seen? And had that person never returned? He did not know. And the dog could not say. Only its eyes every night still looked in the same direction, as if something, somewhere, invisible to everyone else, was still visible to it, or perhaps still remembered. Liam pulled the chair closer to the deck's edge, where the wood had begun to rot, where the wind blew sharper, where the salt licked at the hem of his coat. He zipped the collar higher and looked down at the dog lying unmoving beside him, its breath shallow like the waves far offshore, no longer hurried but still unsure. The gauze had darkened with time, yet it did not scratch, did not whimper, did not react, just lay there like a living stone, heavy but unwilling to let go. After a long silence, Liam spoke. Not loudly, not solemnly, just loud enough for the wind not to steal the words away. Marie died during the rainy season, July. The sentence fell out, no prelude, no warning, like a blade slicing through time, letting memory return without needing to be summoned. He did not look at the dog, only at the sea, his gaze blurred with the tides. She liked to read. Every night she'd read to me, just a few pages, whether I was asleep or not. Marie believed that a steady voice could keep a heart from beating too fast when it's scared, and could remind a person they were still alive, even in silence. The wind swept sideways, pulling his hair back. The ocean shone faintly beneath a pale moon veiled by thin clouds. The dog didn't turn its head, but one ear twitched. Liam continued. I thought I could save her, not because I was a rescue man, but because I was her husband. I believed if I was strong enough, determined enough, quiet enough, if I didn't complain, then God, or fate, or whatever's out there, would let her stay just a little longer. He swallowed hard, fingers curling into fists against his knee. The dog shifted slightly. Not much, just a movement of the leg, as if adjusting its posture to listen better. But one morning, Marie looked at me, placed her hand over mine, and said 3 words. I'm sorry. I sat with her the whole night, didn't speak, didn't cry, and when she stopped breathing, I didn't let go of her hand, because I was afraid that if I did, I wouldn't know who I was anymore. Liam tilted his face up toward the sky, not because it was beautiful, but because he could no longer bear to look at anything in front of him. And from that moment on, I drifted. I didn't do much. I didn't sleep deeply. I didn't speak unless I had to. I stopped rising when I heard footsteps. I survived by becoming untouchable, and if you hadn't swum to that boat on that day, I think I would still be drifting like that now. Touching no one, letting no one touch me. The dog slowly turned its head. Its eyes were no longer clear, but clouded with the weight of something older than tears. Not moisture, not reflection, but the kind of fog memory gathers after it's been dragged across too many days of silent endurance. Liam smiled, for the first time. Not because he was happy, but because he had been in pain long enough to recognize when something started to lift. I don't know who you are. I don't know who you served. But if you once had someone who lay beside you like this, someone whose breath in the dark let you know you weren't alone, and then one day, that breath stopped, then I understand. The dog didn't bark, didn't bow its head, didn't do any of the things people write about when they tell stories of loyalty. It only looked, long and still, as if, for the first time since being left behind, someone had spoken aloud the thing it never knew how to name. Not, "I'm sorry," not "thank you," not "I'll help," but simply, "I've been where you are." Liam reached out, not to pat, not to grip, not to pull, just placed his hand beside the dog's, close but not touching. And Morrow tilted his head, inching forward, gently resting his chin on the back of Liam's hand. Not pressing down, not leaning in, but just enough to let something pass through skin and bone that didn't require sound. "I hear you, I understand, and I'm here." There, in the middle of the night, on the cold deck of a boat, under a lighthouse whose signal had long gone dark, two living beings, one man, one dog, began to connect, not through what remained, but through what had been lost. They didn't speak of the future, didn't promise to heal, didn't dare guess what tomorrow might bring. They just knew. Tonight, if they could exist side by side in silence, that alone would be enough to start believing again. And the first thing that changed wasn't the scab on a wound, nor the return of a bark. It was the gaze. Morrow, the name Liam never said aloud, but that had begun to echo quietly in his mind, started to look at him differently. Not with the gaze of a creature observing its surroundings. Not with the empty stare of something resigned to fate. But with a look that had depth, rhythm, response, return. He didn't wait for commands, didn't expect food in exchange. Just a head tilt when Liam sighed, a slow blink when Liam sat down, a quiet tracking of every step when he walked off the deck, as if ready to follow if asked. Liam didn't register this shift with logic, but with instinct, that old rescue sense, the one that knew too well the difference between a gaze that waits to be saved and a gaze that no longer believes it's worth the saving. And Morrow was beginning to move from the second back toward the first. Not suddenly, not cleanly, but gradually. Like that morning when Liam woke to the wind peeling back the edge of the tarp. He rubbed his eyes, not yet sitting up, and felt something warm pressed against his leg. Morrow, no longer sleeping at a distance, had edged closer, not resting his head, not nudging for touch, just lying close enough that breath warmed skin, that a heartbeat brushed across the edge of his coat. And when Liam shifted, Morrow's eyes opened, not wary, but acknowledging. "I know you're here." And deeper still, "I want you to stay." Liam didn't touch, didn't speak, he just lay still, eyes open staring into the pale arch of misted sky, and in that silence, he realized he was relearning a language, one with no vocabulary, no grammar, no tense, but one that could still be felt through the smallest gestures. A brief sigh, a subtle head lift, a slow rising to stand, and a gaze that no longer turned away. That was the evolution of trust, not loud, not dramatic, but slowly, steadily sinking into every minor movement. Like that evening, when Liam lifted the water hatch, the hinge screeched, and he flinched, worried the sound might startle Morrow. But when he looked back, Morrow remained still, blinking slowly, tail twitching once, not in reflex, but as if to say, "I know that sound doesn't mean pain." And in the world of creatures once ripped away from all anchors, that single allowance was a monumental shift. That night, when the temperature dropped, Liam laid an old wool blanket beside the deck, right where he usually sat to read his old journals. He didn't call, didn't gesture. But when he opened the book, and the wind flipped a few pages ahead, he murmured softly, "9th day at the old lighthouse." Morrow stood, without reason, walked over, sat down on the blanket and lay beside it. Not by chance, not by reflex, but with intent, from eyes that had begun to read emotion. Liam closed the journal. He didn't write anything more, because that day's entry no longer needed words. Only the pair of eyes watching him, not asking who he was, not asking why they were here, just wanting to be sure of one thing. I can still respond to someone. I am still part of something. And for Liam, that was enough to make his chest warm again. No bark was needed, no games, only a gaze, step by step, returning to life. Each look that didn't flinch when Liam came close, each moment of eye contact that held on, as if tying an invisible cord between two beings, learning not to fear closeness anymore. Liam sat by the edge of the boat, hands wrapped tightly around the handle of a metal kettle still warm from the battered oil stove below. Steam fogged up his glasses, but sight no longer mattered, because the signals that meant the most were now exchanged in the spaces between silence. Morrow lay not far from him, chin resting on his hind legs, eyes open but unfocused, not scanning for threats, not awaiting commands, just watching the space between them, where loss no longer sat as a wound, but as a quiet, gray patch of belonging. A place neither of them had to defend anymore. He set the water flask down, then lowered himself beside the dog. No words were spoken, no space was tidied. He simply sat, like a shadow with form, present but weightless. After a while, once the warmth from the flask began to seep into the air between them, he reached out, not to check a wound, not to call its name, just a hand, open, unforced, suspended gently in the space between waiting and retreat. And Morrow, instead of pulling back as he had each time before, tilted his head. Softly. Not quickly. Not like reflex. But like a choice made with care after weighing the cost. He tilted until his cheek just barely brushed the back of Liam's hand. Only once. But he did not move away. Liam held his breath, not out of fear, but out of that quiet, sacred dread that the slightest shift might shatter something too fragile to last, something so new it hadn't yet found its name, something so easily undone a stronger gust might carry it off. And in that moment, faint but undeniable, he heard the first sound. Not a bark, not a growl, not any sound one might expect from a dog. Just an exhale, longer than usual, heavier, carrying a grain of sound, like a sigh released from the chest. Not because of pain, not as a cry for help, but as if, for the first time in countless months, across unknown miles, through torn memories and silent crossings, Morrow had been touched without having to brace for harm, without flinching, without needing to decide whether to bite or flee. Liam leaned forward. His gaze landed on the dog's soaked neck, where the fur had dried into curled ridges from salt and wind. He placed his hand there, pressed it, not to soothe, not to stroke, just placed it. And the sound came again, this time deeper, clearer, like the breath of someone who had just made it through a fever, not yet healed, but no longer dying. He whispered, "You hear me, don't you?" Morrow gave no answer, but his eyes half-lidded, his ears relaxed, his spine loosened, the tension in his shoulders dropped, like a door no longer held shut by a piece of wood wedged too long. And for the first time, Liam understood something he had never been able to say aloud. This dog was not simply recovering. He was beginning to choose the belief that touch might exist without consequence. That night, Liam didn't pitch the tent inside the cabin like he usually did. He brought out the blanket, laid it on the deck beside Morrow at arm's length. No contact, no shared gaze. Just lying there, breathing the same wind, listening to the same mast creak, letting that long sigh remain between them like a waypoint, like a flag quietly planted in silence. Not all creatures need words. Some souls just need to breathe, long enough, warmly enough, beside someone who does not walk away when the breath finally comes out. The next morning, light did not flood the deck as it had on other days. It crept in, slowly, through the cracks in the warped wood, slanting between Liam's fingers where they rested beside the damp fur that had not yet dried completely, allowing him to feel the skin underneath. Still unsteady, still tender, but now rhythmic, now stable, like a body gradually remembering how to live without running on survival alone. He opened the first aid kit, pulled out a pair of surgical scissors and a dulled utility knife, preparing to change Morrow's dressing, not in hope of miracles, but to keep a quiet promise. If you stay, I will not let you rot. I will not walk away halfway like those who once abandoned you. The bandage along Morrow's side was blood-stained, not freshly, but enough to tell him the wound hadn't yet settled the way he hoped. He removed the gauze gently, layer by layer, cleaned it with warm water, then angled the flashlight closer. And for the first time since he had started dressing it, he saw the full incision, roughly the width of 3 fingers, sharp-edged with clean lines, no tearing, no jagged tissue, the kind of contour that came not from trauma, not from thorns or coral or impact, but from precision. It was not a wound born of accident. It had not come from neglect or natural harm. It was a surgical cut, a deliberate one. His hand paused mid-motion, and though no words passed his lips, something stirred inside Liam, a sensation long buried but unmistakably familiar from the years he had worked in search and rescue. That kind of instinct which doesn't need reason, doesn't wait for evidence, the kind born from seeing too many things that others dismissed as odd but irrelevant, only to later realize those were always where the real stories began. He pulled the chair closer, wiped the area clean again, and, using the side angle of the flashlight, examined it more thoroughly. And that's when he noticed a detail so minute it could have been missed by anyone less patient. Some of the skin around the incision still bore the faint trace of inner sutures, the type that doesn't dissolve, the kind used in surgeries to embed tracking chips. His heart kicked once, sharp, and when he connected it with the older scar behind the ear, where the K9 tattoo had been methodically faded, the picture that formed didn't need to be complete. It was already too much, enough to set every nerve in his body on alert. What he had before him wasn't just a wounded stray, it was a dog that had once belonged to a system, a dog someone had taken the time and effort to erase. And erasure, not abandonment, is always the louder secret. This wasn't the story of a service dog lost in combat. It wasn't an accidental drift. It wasn't a mistake. Someone had deliberately erased its identity. Someone had intervened with its body the way people wipe data from a hard drive. Someone had wanted to strip it clean of any trace of where it once belonged. And all that remained was a creature carrying a technical scar, eyes that had once obeyed, a symbol blurred by time and force, and a journey so solitary it led all the way to the deck of a man who had once lost his wife because he couldn't save her. Liam didn't need confirmation. He didn't need a file. All he needed was to place his hand on the now clean skin, to feel the subtle reflex twitch beneath his thumb as it rested against that precise intersection of flesh and scar, and that alone was enough for him to know. What lay before him was not a discarded animal, but a fragment left behind from a system that once needed it, then decided to erase it as though it had never existed. He clenched his hand, not from anger, but from that old, haunting helplessness that had lived inside him for years, the same helplessness that once made him sit for hours beside Marie's hospital bed, with nothing to offer but the ache of watching pain accumulate day by day. the same helplessness that had made him scream in silence, reading those letters of denial, those refusals of help at the moment help was most needed. And now, again, that helplessness surfaced as he looked at this creature, one once trained to serve, to protect, to remain loyal, now left stripped of its name with a cruelty so clinical it bordered on inhuman. Liam didn't know who had done it, didn't know why, didn't know what happened in Morrow's former unit, if there was still a unit left to be named at all. But he knew one thing, and this time he didn't need anyone to tell him. If Morrow had swum across miles of open sea to reach him, then somewhere behind that journey was a darkness no one wanted exposed to the light. He reached for more gauze, cleaned the wound again, wrapped it more carefully, then placed a hand on Morrow's head. Not pressing, just resting. And this time, instead of sighing like on all those nights before, Morrow opened his eyes, held Liam's gaze, and didn't look away, as though two minds had just read the same torn-off note someone had once tried to destroy, and were now rewriting it together, word by word, in silence, in presence, in blood. And just as Liam bent forward to close the medical kit, the sound came, faint, like the shudder of a winged insect losing flight, yet sharp enough to raise every hair at the back of his neck, as if his body had remembered something that his conscious mind had not yet defined. A mechanical sound, familiar, unnatural, not from wind, not from wave, but from something moving through the air, silent, steady, with purpose. Liam didn't spring up like the heroes in movies. He didn't shout Morrow's name. He simply lifted his eyes, slowly, following the sound's direction behind the lighthouse tower, where the concrete spire cast a long shadow across the deck like a quiet incision into the wood. And there, right on the edge of light, a small object hovered, rotating gently, not seeing but remembering. A drone. A civilian model. No weapons, no lights, no markings, but it hadn't come this far out of curiosity, and certainly not by accident. Liam's fist clenched instinctively, then immediately he bent down, grabbed the old tarp he always kept to shield the boat from storm, and threw it over Morrow, who hadn't yet reacted, before shifting his own body, becoming the shield, placing himself between the drone's eye and the line of the healing wound. The drone dipped lower, not diving, not scanning, just circling. Slowly, as if someone far away was steering it with full awareness of what they were looking for, what they were seeing, and what must not be in the frame if this were just some wandering flight. The wind shifted. The sunlight sharpened, piercing through the grimy glass of the abandoned tower. Sweat slid down Liam's temple to his collar, but he didn't wipe it, because in moments like these, even the smallest movement could tell whoever was watching that what they were looking for was real. The drone circled once more, then climbed, then vanished westward, toward the one direction with no shipping routes, no fishing vessels, and no active maritime signals for the past 4 years. Liam said nothing. He just exhaled. Once, short, deep, and enough to know, the danger had begun. Not from nature, not from the wild, but from people. He peeled back the tarp from Morrow, stroked gently along the dog's neck. His hand was trembling, not from fear, but from the deep understanding that no one flew a drone to an abandoned offshore lighthouse without a reason. And if that reason had anything to do with the creature he was now protecting, then someone, somewhere, did not want it to survive. Liam stood, walked into the cabin, opened an old drawer, and pulled out a rusted tin box filled with electronics he hadn't touched in years. He reassembled the short-range signal jammer, a basic device, but enough to cut autopilot flight paths, then checked the backup battery. His hands weren't fast anymore, no longer steady like they once were in the technical division, But the steps returned from memory, each movement guided by the muscle memory of someone who had once belonged to a world where precision was the only thing that kept people alive. Morrow didn't move, but his eyes were open. And for the first time since stepping on board, those eyes weren't turned toward the ocean. They were fixed on Liam, not in panic, not in warning, but with the gaze of something that knew. We might have to run again. But Liam wouldn't let that thought settle. He stepped forward, knelt, placed his hand gently on Morrow's head, not scratching, not soothing, just resting it there as a signal, an anchor. No one's going to find you here. I won't let that happen. Not a vow, not a dramatic promise, just a statement from a man who had already lost everything and now stood before a creature whose identity had been torn away just like his own, and simply refused to let that story be repeated again. Because he had known helplessness before. But not this time. Not now. And if anyone, anywhere, had once believed that Morrow had been forgotten, erased, drifted far enough from the system to dissolve into nothingness, then today, they would know the truth. Not every old vessel is broken, not every dormant light has gone out, and not every survivor agrees to be left behind. Liam stood inside the gutted engine room, where radio waves had once been amplified through metal tubing in place of antennas, where every frequency adjustment had worn shallow grooves into the hardened plastic knobs, and where his hand now turned the pages of a thin notebook, kept not from habit, but because it contained frequencies encoded in a way only two men had ever understood, two men who had once sat across from each other in the dim, stale air of an underground command room, a place where operational maps were assembled from cold grid lines, and yet, occasionally, where life and death were decided by a single silent nod. His finger slid across one penciled marking, faint and smudged. 81.60, a frequency decommissioned nearly a decade ago, no longer part of the active net, but still functional through independent radio bursts, often used in emergencies, or when those who once wore the same uniform needed to reach each other without leaving a trace in any logbook. He turned the dial, waiting for the static to settle, then pressed the transmission key. No name, no identification, no greeting. Just 3 words, spoken like they once rehearsed them for moments when there was no time to explain. Echo. 1. Alive. Silence. A long, stretched silence. Only the soft clicks of the old unit filtered through the air like the uneven beat of a heart struggling to restart. Then a voice, rougher, older than he remembered, returned across the static, with no code, no questions, no delay. Location? Liam turned his head towards the round porthole, saw Morrow still lying on the deck, head resting across his front paws, eyes closed, chest rising in slow, steady rhythm, like someone not quite asleep, but no longer on guard. He answered with a single word, no elaboration needed. Tower. No one asked which tower. No one needed coordinates. No one demanded authentication. Because some men, those who had crossed the wire together, who had carried lives and reports signed at 2 a.m., who had stood quiet before decisions that would never be spoken of again, needed only one word to know exactly where the other stood. The voice on the line dropped in pitch, slower now. You sure? It's him? Liam paused. And when he spoke again, even he noticed the difference in his tone. It wasn't cold nor shaky, but drawn from somewhere deeper, slower, where only truths lived. If it's not him, it's the one they killed to replace him. No sigh came, no emotion registered, just another silence, longer this time. Then the voice returned, firm as a closing latch. I'm coming. No one else, no questions. Give me 36 hours. Liam exhaled, not with relief, but like a man setting down a heavy case in preparation for whatever it might soon be forced to carry. Because he knew, if Kellen had agreed to come, it meant he understood that what was buried here wasn't just a dog, but a severed fragment of something the system had intentionally tried to unwrite, using reasons not even those inside the system were allowed to know. He ended the transmission. No notes taken, no circles drawn, just the quiet closing of the device into its tin box and the slow turn of his body back toward the deck. Morrow still lay where he had left him. But this time when Liam approached, the dog opened his eyes, not merely to look, but to assess. Liam didn't flinch. He walked forward, sat beside him, and spoke, low and steady, just enough to outrun the wind. Someone's coming. The last one I trust. No reports, no pictures, no trail. Just one man and one answer. Morrow didn't react, just tilted his head, slightly, the way he often did when Liam's sentences grew longer than usual. And for the first time since this began, Liam didn't feel like he was speaking to a dog, but to a soldier. A comrade long erased from the ledger. A friend whose face he'd never seen, yet who shared the same long silence no one else ever truly heard. The morning came without fog. The sky was so clear the sea mirrored the rising sun like a sheet of tarnished silver, scraped gently by the small cresting waves, and Liam, rather than lighting the stove or checking the power box as he usually did, stood still at the edge of the boat, eyes on the narrow wooden path that led from the lighthouse to the thin stretch of beach, a path long untouched, the same path he once walked daily in the final years of his service, a path he never thought he'd see again, until a creature cast out to sea pulled him back to this place, not to relive a past, but to reclaim the part of himself he'd left behind without even knowing it. Morrow, without a call, had begun to rise the moment Liam opened the rear windbreak on the deck, stepping forward not with urgency, but with instinct, not staggering, but not yet steady, not growling, but not yet certain, like someone who had clawed their way out of being buried alive, only to realize that beyond the tunnel's end, there might still be another trap instead of light. Liam gave no signal. He simply stepped back, just one step, and left the threshold between two worlds, one a boat, one ashore, to open not by command, not by invitation, but by the choice of a creature who had once been deliberately erased from existence. Morrow paused at the edge of the wooden deck, just before the final plank that connected to land, staring down at the small space between hull and dock, a distance barely wider than a cat's leap. But to him, it was not a physical gap. It was a dividing line between mere survival and the audacity to choose. Then he stepped. Not a leap, not a bound, a step, slow, measured, and every trembling joint beneath him did not shake from fear, but from the hesitant disbelief of a body still unsure whether it was truly allowed to touch something that did not sway, did not drift, did not crash like the waves. When his front paws landed on the plank, his whole body seemed to brace, not just to support weight, but to carry the soul that had dragged itself across too many miles of water. And when all four paws were finally planted on steady ground, for the very first time since Liam had met him, Morrow raised his head. Not toward the man, not toward the sea, but toward the sand, where sunlight spilled in uneven bands between pillars and broken stone. Liam did not follow, did not coax. He simply stood, 3 steps behind, watching the creature whose breath still trembled but whose body did not retreat, did not turn back to the boat, did not seek refuge, but moved forward slowly, without hesitation, as if knowing that if he didn't walk now, there might never be a first time again, and each paw print pressed into the sand like a wordless rite, the first contact with land. There was no applause, no audience, only the man who had tied the boat to shore with the same rope he once used to fasten storm sails, watching a life he thought only needed saving, now show him, through the quietest movement of return, that perhaps it was he who had just been opened, not with words, but with the slow unfolding of something still willing to trust. Liam followed behind, not too close, not stepping ahead, allowing Morrow to walk at his own rhythm, and when the sand slipped between the pads of his feet, there was no panic, no recoiling, just a long, soft breath, as if part of his body had finally received the message. You still exist. Liam sat down. Not calling, not praising, not whispering, "Good boy," like humans often do with dogs. He simply folded his knees, crossed his arms over his lap, and looked out to sea, allowing the space between them to become not a gap, but a shared breath. Morrow turned. He didn't press near. He simply stood, facing him, just close enough that Liam could see his eyes open, his ears lifted, and his tail no longer pressed tight to the ground, but resting lightly, like a blade of grass moved by wind. And in that moment, Liam knew. He hadn't just saved a dog. He was witnessing a beginning. Not the start of a new mission. Not the revival of a long-lost role. But the beginning of something only those who have lost everything can fully recognize. The right to exist, without explanation. And the next morning, before the first rays of sun could even dry the dew clinging to the salt-worn railings, Liam was already checking the engine system, wiping clean the face of the compass, tying down every inch of waveguard netting, preparing not for a routine departure as a fisherman, but for a departure that belonged to those who had nothing left to lose, yet still wanted to preserve the one thing left worth protecting in another. No schedule, no official sea chart, only a faint coordinate in memory, marked not by a place name, but by Kellen's words from a decade ago, spoken when they buried the last piece of equipment beneath concrete and sealed the door like a tomb. That place, if needed, will be where no one looks, but safe enough to begin again. And now, he needed it, not to hide, not to end, but to bring a being, once deleted from the list of the living, back to its own point of origin. Morrow lay on the rear deck just behind the cabin, unchained, untied, with only a thin blanket beneath him, a bowl of water beside him, and a gaze that flicked occasionally toward Liam. Not searching, not guarded, but sending out a quiet, steady signal. I'm still here, and I will wait. Liam pressed the throttle. The engine hummed low and then steadied, the hull gliding through waves as though it had never aged, as though it too sensed that this departure was unlike any before, not driven by the hope of a catch, nor by the fatigue of needing solitude, but by the resolve to recover something that had once been buried by force, the worth of a life built for loyalty, then cast aside as if it had given nothing of value at all. The sea was restless, the wind unkind, the sky slowly staining itself in thin washes of ink, as if nature itself wanted to know whether two beings, one who had walked away from his own glory and another whose name had been sliced from his very skin, were truly ready to go all the way to the end of this journey. Liam didn't speak to Morrow for the first 4 hours. He just steered, gripping the throttle firmly, eyes fixed forward, his mind taut like the strings of a storm-time rescue mission. But somehow, Morrow understood. He didn't move much. He shifted just enough to protect his wound, eyes never fully closed, only half-lidded, the way soldiers learn to rest when danger could come at any moment. By late afternoon, when the horizon began shrinking behind the familiar rocky silhouettes of the western ridge, once home to the classified K-9 training base, Liam slowed down, gently pulled the wheel to the left, and turned into a waterway only insiders would know. A narrow cut veiled by wild overgrowth, unmarked on any map, visible only when the sun leaned at the right angle, revealing a wave channel no wider than a heartbeat flowing through the middle of a forest's memory. And like a heartbeat roused from stillness, the boat slipped inward, gradually slowing until it came to a full stop alongside a rotted wooden dock, one with no signs, no cameras, no sentries, but one that had once held things the world outside never dared admit had existed. Liam stepped off without a word, without a signal. He simply turned, held out his hand, not to call, not to command, but to leave the choice to Morrow. And Morrow stepped, a second landing, this time, less trembling than the first. One foreleg touched ground, then the other. No glances back, no sweeping for safety. Just movement, slow, steady, as if he understood that this place, though unfamiliar, was the right destination. From the forest behind the dock, a figure emerged, a canvas shirt, hair grayer than before, eyes like steel forged through pressure over time. Kellen. No questions, no exclamations, just steps, until he stopped 1 meter away. His gaze passed over Liam and settled on Morrow. No blinking, no uncertainty. Just a single sentence, low, almost whispered to himself. They didn't kill him. And Liam, though already knowing, still felt his chest tighten. Not from surprise, but because that confirmation, from the man who once kept the full roster of every canine operative, meant only one thing. Morrow had indeed been sentenced. And today, by way of a storm-defying return, he stood again. Not to reclaim justice, not for vengeance, but simply to stand, there in the unmarked woods, as proof that some beings, even when denied and discarded, survive not because of luck, but because someone, somewhere, refused to turn away. But even in places that look like safety, even when the signs of pursuit have vanished and the past folds itself quietly into a wooden cabin beside a moss-veiled shore, the sea, like a force no man ever truly commands, always finds its way to remind us that the trial is not over, and that every life still breathing must, at some point, pay its due, with one more struggle at the edge between surviving and fading. On the return route, after Kellen handed Liam a tightly wrapped cloth bag, inside raw data, codes, unedited files, heat maps, and a cut segment of video once erased from official storage, all sealed in a trust that needed no signature, only the quiet certainty of, you need to know, but choose carefully who else should. Liam didn't answer, just nodded, because sometimes, in a crosswind, one nod is enough to turn a life onto a new course. And so, he turned back toward the boat. Morrow followed. No leash, no command. He knew, and so did Liam, that this time their departure was not an escape, but a crossing without return. The sky broke just an hour after they left the bay. No warning, no build-up, just a single bolt slicing the ocean's skin like the blade of an executioner. And then the tarp flew loose. The sea drummed against the hull like 1,000 fists, testing whether the old boat still had the will to stay whole through the storm. Liam didn't turn, didn't veer, just gripped the tiller, held the bow straight, letting the path they had chosen remain unswerved, even as the wind howled and the rain drove like punishment. But not every storm can be weathered by resolve alone. One sudden gust, just as Liam stepped back to check the mooring, snatched him off the deck like a dry leaf in a cyclone, and as his hand clawed for anchor, with nothing beneath him but air and the dark sea waiting, it was at that precise moment that something pulled back, not rope, not net, but a sharp, deliberate yank from his collar. And when he turned, arms still reaching, what he saw was not the water, not death, but eyes. amber-brown, locked onto his with the one instinct left unbroken. Don't let go. Morrow, gripping, not biting, but holding. No thrashing, no panic. Just a braced body, crouched low, hind legs spread for balance on the rain-slick deck, back curved, muscles tensed like drawn wire. And every last thread of life focused on one thing. Don't let this man fall. And Liam, dangling between ocean and existence, understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, something rescue workers and soldiers often forget. You are not always the savior. Sometimes, the one they call the rescued is the one keeping you from disappearing. He caught the railing. Morrow held steady, didn't release until Liam was fully back aboard, body sprawled, breath heavy. Only then did he let go. No bark, no whine, just stood there, soaked, heaving, sea foam bubbling at his lips, staring at Liam like an officer gauging whether his commanding officer was still fit to carry on. Liam sat up, shaking, aching, drained, but not afraid. Only one sentence emerged from his chest, shaped without effort. You chose me, just like I chose you. No one heard it. No one would record it. Only the waves, still roaring, and one old boat, still holding course. The next morning, as the mist lifted slowly off the deck, painting everything in faded silver, Liam guided Morrow back toward the rendezvous point, where the forest's edge broke into a narrow trail, just wide enough for a man and a being quiet enough not to be found, where the wind didn't scream but breathed, and the birds didn't sing but whispered, that life, somewhere, was still trying to survive among all that had once been left behind. Kellen was waiting inside a weather-worn canvas tent. Its military insignia faded to a blur, standing beside an old film projector. An object so obsolete it seemed banished from a world now run by satellites and microchips. And yet, somehow, it was the only machine capable of transmitting a film that didn't exist on any system, because the truth it held had never been allowed to. He did not greet, did not ask about Morrow. He simply turned the reel, slowly, deliberately, until light from the rectangular lens flared onto a thin cloth screen stretched between two tree trunks, and in a matter of seconds, the wooden walls around them melted into the silence of memory, a space where time collapsed and moments once sealed away began to fracture into grainy, flickering fragments. The image quivered. Then came into view an unnamed location, the ground coated in dust and ash, a soft static humming beneath a man's voice, barking orders. A team of 4 K9s entered frame, all German shepherds, same size, same bearing, distinguished only by the faint identifiers inked behind their ears. Liam recognized the third, not by its form, not by its gait, but by the way it stopped, slightly off angle, head tilted, left ear raised just a little higher than the right. It was Morrow. Unmistakable. It could not have been any other. The footage continued. Short, but enough to contain everything the unit had once fought to keep buried. A covert operation, compromised, shots fired, lives lost, no emergency signal sent, and then a report flashed on screen, transmitted back to Central Command with a brief, clinical conclusion. K9-Delta-3, KIA, remains not recovered. A declaration of death. No admission of failure. No explanation of why the body wasn't brought back, because, plainly, no one wanted it brought back. And then, the projector clicked off. The room returned to the hush of afternoon shadow, with only the low murmur of the cooling fan still spinning like the heartbeat of something that refused to die. Kellen sat down, picked up a thick folder, its pages yellowed by age and monsoon rains that had seeped through the old base's walls. He flipped through the first few sheets, then pulled out a final photograph. Not clear, not sharp, but enough to see Morrow, limbs bound, placed inside a metal cage half submerged in water, eyes still open, while the corner of the image bore the logo of a division that had been dismantled after a ruthless internal purge. "He didn't deserve that," Kellen said, his voice low, without expectation of reply. Then he handed the file to Liam, his tone falling into something solemn, like a pledge spoken by the last man still holding memory. "They erased everything, but they couldn't erase the ones who lived. You are proof, and so is he." Liam took it. His hands didn't shake. He didn't refuse, because from the moment Morrow had steadied him on the deck, when he nearly slipped into the sea, Liam had ceased to be an outsider. Now, they both stood inside a memory that had been sealed away. One man, one dog, one past, once discarded. Morrow walked to Liam, unprompted. He sat beside him, didn't growl, didn't whimper, just breathed, in long, slow rhythm, as if he too was staring into the final image of the soldier he used to be. And Liam placed his hand on the back of Morrow's neck, not saying anything, but within his chest, a single thought rang so loud it needed no sound. "From this moment on, no one gets to declare you dead ever again." That evening, as the sky tilted toward a soft gold that didn't hurry the sunset, Liam didn't leave right away, nor did he linger as if reluctant. He simply stood there, beside the rust-stained iron gate leading into the facility, eyes following Morrow's silhouette as Kellen led him inside. No leash, no commands, just a quiet walk behind the man who had once trained his kind from the earliest iterations. The wind passed through the trees, ringing the rescue compound, carrying with it the faded scent of sea salt, moss, and dried bark, mingling into an atmosphere that felt neither past nor present, as if time was no longer counted in days, but in the moments when a living being crossed from being forgotten to being seen again. Liam returned to the boat, didn't pull the anchor yet, just sat on the deck, back resting against the cabin, hands on his knees, eyes following the slow drift of the sky. Morrow, even then, didn't disappear fully inside. He walked only as far as the patch of grass beside the fence, where old claw marks still faintly scored the dirt, where the grass had long since bent into the shape of circles, and lay down there, facing the gate. And Liam understood. He wasn't guarding anything. He was waiting. Not in the way house dogs wait for a dish or a call, not in the way trained canines wait, tight with anticipation for the next task, but in the way of a creature that had once stopped believing it had the right to hope at all, and now, after someone truly came back for him, discovered that the simple act of being present at dusk was enough to sit still, eyes open, heart unguarded, and not rush forward, because he knew the man would come. The next day, and the day after, it repeated, gently. Liam never arrived at the same hour, but whenever he came, Morrow was already there, sitting by the gate, waiting, not anxious, not restless, just existing in the rhythm of a quiet ritual that no one had taught, that didn't require words, just something that formed between two beings who had once stood on either side of a war. And when Liam stepped off the dock, tied the boat, walked up the slope, and sat on the old wooden bench that Kellen had put back after years of disuse, Morrow only tilted his head, exhaled slowly, and lay down again, not needing to approach, not needing to touch, just needing to be there, to know he hadn't been left behind. The sunsets came each evening, not ever the same, but always carrying the kind of light that softened every hard corner inside a man. And when the last rays landed on Morrow's ears that had once shot upward at every command, but now only twitched gently like a memory half-remembered, Liam understood. He was no longer standing guard for the military. He was standing guard for his own memory. And he, the man who once believed he had lost the ability to connect, now sat every day in that small space carved out by silence, to speak without words to a being who understood the discipline of quiet at the right moments, who could meet your gaze without making you recoil, and who knew how to wait without ever asking, "When will this end?" Kellen passed by more than once. Each time he saw Liam, he merely nodded. He didn't interfere. Because he understood, this was no longer about a trainer and a trained animal, but something else entirely. Deeper, unquantifiable, immune to tactical data or behavioral models. Perhaps, every evening, Morrow didn't sit there because he was waiting for someone. He sat there to ensure that the memory of that someone still lived. And Liam, each time he left, never waved, never called out. He simply turned slowly, deliberately, as if to let Morrow know, "I'm not disappearing. I'll be back tomorrow." The gate remained open. The rescue post unlocked. The footpath still as intact as it was in those first evenings, when everything still felt fragile, like the breathing of a creature once cast beyond the border of what we call humane. But now, even as the light grew dim and the wind lifted every brittle leaf along the stone steps to the dock, there was nothing left that Morrow had to brace against. Because every day, he still came. Not early, not late, just enough to remind him that he was still remembered. That day was no different. The sky poured out a pale orange, like the yolk of a broken egg spilling slowly across the water's surface. Liam set the cloth bag on the wooden bench, didn't sit immediately, just stood for a while, sensing that something in the air was denser than usual, not in motion, but in feeling, like an event not yet happened but already spreading its weight across the moment. Morrow wasn't at the fence like usual. He had already stood, quietly, without being called, without needing a signal. And he walked forward. Slowly, steadily, each step feeling like it had been rehearsed somewhere in the memory they both shared but never dared to speak aloud. And when Liam turned, before he could even lift his hand, Morrow had stopped beside him. No growl, no wagging tail, no whine like the dogs raised to demonstrate affection. He simply rested his head on Liam's hand, slow, heavy, warm. A movement that lasted less than a second, yet suspended time itself between two beings who had both fought simply for the right to exist. No one said thank you. No one asked for confirmation. No one captured the moment for retelling. There was only action. Wholly human, fully canine, deeply alive. And Liam, for the first time since Marie's death, felt his hand no longer wandering in search of purpose. He didn't stroke, didn't tighten, just held his hand there, still as if to pass into Morrow everything that words had always failed to say. You are no longer at the bottom. Morrow stayed for a few breaths more, then pulled back, turned around, and lay down at his usual spot, as if nothing had happened. But something had. Not in the eyes, not in the gestures, but in the time itself. Because in that moment, when a creature once erased from every system, once left to die at sea, once recorded in a file as deceased, no retrieval required, was able to walk, by choice, toward another, and lay his head not to beg, not to plead, but to acknowledge a bond. Then the abyss that once swallowed him had released its hold. There was ground now. There was light. And there was one man, still showing up, just to sit nearby. That evening passed like every other, uneventful, but in Liam's heart, something had quietly closed. Not with pain, not to erase the past, but for the first time in years, he no longer needed a reason to keep going, because Morrow's existence, and his own presence beside him, was already enough. For those still holding on. Even if you've walked through fractures you thought could never close again, even if your heart bleeds each time it brushes against an old scent, an old sound, or a memory you thought you'd forgotten, please don't hide forever in the dark. Not because the world will change, not because the pain will vanish, but because, if you hide too long, the people who truly want to come closer won't know where to find you. Like the two souls in this story, one man who had lost everything, one creature who had been stripped even of his name. They didn't heal each other, didn't demand strength, didn't carry the burden of making the other whole. They simply stayed, each sunset, each breath. And in that quiet, the most fragile bridge was formed between two hearts once torn wide open. You don't have to be strong alone. You only need the courage to show up, whether through tired eyes or trembling hands. Because sometimes, it's the most wounded souls who can hear each other the clearest. And when two heartbeats, without speaking, still manage to recognize one another, then you'll understand. We were not born to stay lost in the dark. We were born so that one day, in the vast stillness, someone patient enough might sit down beside us and, without needing to explain, somehow say, "I've been there too. So let's carry this pain together." Let that message travel. Slowly, gently, deep enough for someone out there, still shivering, to know they too can still be seen. A little girl who hadn't spoken a single word in over a year, a German shepherd who had never barked. But that afternoon, beneath the old tree in a quiet hilltop schoolyard, they brought an entire classroom to silence, and then to tears. As the girl stepped forward, hands trembling while opening her sketchbook, she spoke a single sentence that broke every heart in the room. No one expected it, but all along, it was the dog who had been telling her story. What really happened before that day? And why was Orion the only one who knew? But to understand how she got there, we have to go back. Back to when winter had just arrived in Willow Creek. The town looked like a frozen painting, all soft grays and snowy blues. Hidden deep in the pine-covered hills of Oregon, it stretched barely 4 streets wide. Wooden houses leaned under thick roofs of snow. Chimneys breathed quiet clouds into a tired sky. It wasn't a loud town, especially not in the afternoons, when the sun lingered behind the hills, not quite gone, but too weary to shine. Wind whispered under old porch steps. Chimes clinked gently like secrets passing through the cold. At the edge of Maple Street, the last road before the forest, there stood a 2-story wooden house, its faded green-blue paint worn thin by time. The front windows were always draped in soft, cream-colored curtains, hand-sewn by a mother who once had time for such things. Little silver snowflakes stitched into the fabric caught the late light just enough to look like tiny stars. On the stone steps outside, a tiny pair of snow-dusted shoes sat side by side, as if their owner had only just gone inside and might step back out at any moment. Inside that house lived Liana. She was 9, with wide eyes and quiet hands. She loved to sit by the window, legs dangling, a thick sketchbook always resting on her lap. The pages overflowed with color, watercolors, crayons, and soft pastels. Magic only a child could see. Birds that flew through clouds made of paper, boats that sailed the edge of the sky, foxes that smiled when no one was looking. She would hum softly as she painted, songs without words but full of something true, something that made you believe that maybe even winter could listen. The house used to be full of warmth. Her mother, Rosa, was an ER nurse, kind, always tired, but always home with peppermint candies tucked in her scrub pockets for Liana. Her father, Alan, was a builder, a man who could fix anything with a pencil, a blueprint, and a quiet afternoon. On snowy days, they baked together. Rosa stirred the dough while telling fairy tales. Alan repaired squeaky doors so Liana wouldn't wake from dreams. It was the kind of life that didn't ask for much, but gave a lot just by being gentle. But slowly, the afternoons stopped feeling like that. First came the quiet dinners. Alan came home late. He looked tired, but not the kind of tired that goes away with sleep. His eyes no longer paused on Liana. Then came the weekends he stopped showing up, always working out of town, always taking calls that made Rosa's hands tense when she held the phone. Liana didn't understand all of it, but she noticed the way her mother started looking at her father, a look that held both doubt and something softer, like fear dressed in silence. One day, Liana drew a fox. Its eyes were closed. When Rosa asked her why, Liana answered so softly it barely reached across the room. Because it doesn't want to see anything anymore. Willow Creek was still cold, still quiet, still breathing beneath layers of mist that clung to every rooftop, every tree branch, every window pane. But the little house at the end of Maple Street no longer felt warm. It still stood, still held its shape. But inside the wooden walls, something had changed. Not from cracks you could see, but from the things no one dared to say out loud. And Liana, though too young to understand it all, had started to fall silent more and more, like she was afraid that if she spoke, even a little, everything would shatter like glass on a cold wooden floor. That night, the snow fell heavier than usual. The window fogged with breath. The wall clock had just struck 10. In the kitchen, the lights were still on, but no one had touched the stew Rosa had been stirring all evening. The silver pot still steamed softly, but the air in the house felt dense, like it was holding its breath or choking on something it couldn't name. Liana curled herself into a small space beneath the wooden chair, her arms wrapped tightly around her sketchbook. She heard her father's footsteps in the living room. Slow, heavy, pacing like he needed the floor to feel his anger. No yelling, no shouting, just the sudden crash of dishes breaking against the floor. A sharp voice, her mother's voice, raised, then swallowed back, like it got stuck somewhere deep in her chest. Then something else slammed against the wall. A picture frame? A glass? A body? Liana didn't know. All she knew was that her hands were shaking, and her knees had pulled up to her chest without her even realizing, like her body was trying to make itself small. To disappear. Cold air slipped through the crack under the door and brushed against her like a ghost. But Liana didn't feel it. Her eyes were locked on the table leg, the one with the small scratches she used to cover with star stickers to make it look prettier. She didn't want to cover anything anymore. Everything in this house, even the broken parts, now sat fully exposed, like the truth had stopped waiting for permission to be told. Then came Rosa's voice, not loud, but sharp. A single word. Don't. Not a command. Not a plea. Just pain torn out of her throat without warning. And then, silence. Only breathing, fast, then slower. Then the front door flew open. Rosa stepped into the room. Her hair was wild, her shirt pulled sideways, one shoulder bare. Her face was pale, the kind of pale that made you worry something was terribly wrong. Her eyes scanned the room in a panic, searching. And when she saw Liana huddled beneath the table, still and small, she dropped to her knees. "Sweetheart." That's all she said. No crying, no sobs, just a quiet descent to the floor as she pulled Liana into her arms. Gently, desperately, like she was holding something fragile, something breakable, like a flower in the middle of a storm. Liana didn't respond, didn't speak, didn't lift her head. She just clung tighter to her sketchbook, as if that was the only thing tethering her to the world. 15 minutes later, Rosa took her daughter by the hand and walked out the door. No suitcase, no thick winter coat, just a small backpack and a red umbrella with frayed edges. Alan stood leaning against the porch railing, cigarette in hand, eyes vacant. No one looked at each other. No one apologized. No one explained. The door clicked shut behind them like the final latch closing between two worlds. They walked through the snow-covered street. Maple Street. The same street where Liana had once drawn hopscotch squares in sidewalk chalk. The same street where the sun used to leave golden trails on their porch. Now it was just cold and quiet. Liana held her sketchbook tight against her chest. Her shoes soaked through. But she didn't cry, didn't ask. Just kept walking, one small step at a time. Rosa pulled the scarf tighter around her daughter's neck, wrapped her close, shielding her with her own body as they moved through the yellow haze of the streetlights. Two shadows stretched out behind them on the snow, one small and thin, one trembling, but trying to stay strong. That night, Liana didn't speak, and the next morning, she still didn't. From that day on, she didn't say another word. Not when someone asked a question. Not when someone called her name. Not to the doctors. Not even when Rosa sat beside her, holding her hand for what felt like forever. Liana sat by the window in their new house, smaller, colder, but quieter. There were no crashing sounds here, no yelling, no broken glass or broken voices, just snow falling softly, and her arms wrapped tightly around her sketchbook. Her eyes weren't wet, her cheeks weren't red, she just sat there. Still. Silent. A silence that didn't scream, didn't shiver, didn't heal. It simply layered over her like snow over a wound. No bleeding, no scabbing, just quiet that refused to go away. Rosa never cried in front of her. She moved like someone holding her breath for too long, made appointments, filled out forms, took Liana to the children's hospital in the next town, gathered paperwork, sat late into the night at the old wooden table, flipping through pages of evaluations and case notes, reading every sentence over and over again, like if she connected the pieces right, maybe she could find her daughter inside those files. Then the court date came. The courtroom was small, cold, like everything else in that town. Liana sat between two adults, hands gripping her sketchbook, eyes looking nowhere. The judge was a man in his 50s with a lined face and a voice that didn't try to soften the truth. He asked Liana a few questions. She didn't answer. The legal advocate spoke gently, explaining that her silence wasn't rebellion. It was trauma. That her mind had found safety in quiet, and her voice simply hadn't returned from wherever it had fled. Alan, her father, folded his arms across his chest and sighed. Then said just one thing. I think Rosa is putting these ideas in her head. There wasn't enough evidence to prove abuse. Not legally. Liana hadn't spoken, hadn't drawn it. The reports hinted at trauma, but not enough to reach a conclusion. The court gave Rosa temporary custody, but Alan retained visitation rights, shared guardianship, a verdict that sat somewhere in between justice and avoidance. No one won. But Rosa knew who was still standing in the dark. It wasn't her. It was Liana. They stepped out into the bitter wind of January. Liana didn't speak. She didn't resist either. When Rosa opened the car door, she climbed in, fastened her seatbelt, and turned her face to the window. The trees outside were bare. Every last leaf had fallen. The car pulled away, but Liana's gaze stayed locked on something in the distance, beyond the branches, beyond the rooftops, beyond the snow. Somewhere far. Somewhere where sounds that had been buried were still echoing inside her, quietly, constantly. The new house was a tiny cabin near the edge of the woods, tin roof, creaky floorboards, 2 bedrooms just big enough to hold a bed and a lamp, and a kitchen that opened onto a back porch. Rosa had chosen it for one reason only. It was close to nature, close to the trees, and far, far from people. She thought maybe Liana could breathe easier here. Not recover. She didn't expect that. Just breathe. Every morning, Liana still sat at the window. Some days she painted with no color. Some days she just watched the snow melt through the pine needles. Once, Rosa caught her lowering a brush onto the paper, the tip barely grazing it, then pulling back. Like the image that might come out scared her too much to finish it. No one called her strange, not out loud, but the way they looked at her, it wrapped her in something even heavier than words. A fog she couldn't shake. A hush that didn't erase her voice, only buried it under a kind of fear that had no name. Sometimes Rosa would sit beside her, quietly, lay a hand on her shoulder, and whisper, "I'm here." That's all. Just those 2 words. No pressure, no questions. But Liana wouldn't move, wouldn't lean away, wouldn't lean in. She simply stayed, as if silence had grown roots inside her. Sometimes Rosa wondered, what if her daughter never wanted to return to a world with sound? What if quiet had become home? So the days passed, one after another. Software still, wordless, like even time itself had learned how not to make a sound. Every morning, Liana moved through the house like a shadow, not hurried, not hiding, just drifting. She got dressed by herself, ate the slices of toast Rosa left for her on the small table. Then she took her sketchbook and sat by the window, placing it gently in front of her, always in the same spot. No one told her what to do. Rosa didn't push, didn't ask. She simply placed a warm glass of milk nearby, gave her daughter's shoulder the gentlest touch, and walked away. One time, Rosa purposely left the desk lamp unplugged, hoping maybe Liana would call out like she used to. But Liana said nothing. She opened the drawer, pulled out a tiny flashlight, propped it up against the sketch pad, and kept coloring beneath the soft yellow glow like the world hadn't even blinked. There were no tears, no tantrums, just the quiet presence of a little girl, always there, always steady, like the slow ticking of the old wall clock in the living room that no one had wound in weeks, yet somehow still moved. Each picture Liana drew was different, but they all held something in common. There were no people. She painted fog-covered pine forests, small streams winding under mossy bridges, skies so heavy with gray they seemed to fold into the earth. Her brush strokes were steady, sure, no smudges, no hesitation. But everything she made felt far away, like looking at a beautiful photograph, only to realize the photographer had taken 10 steps back. Eventually, Rosa started taking her to see specialists. The first was a child psychologist at the town hospital, an older woman with soft silver hair, a gentle voice, and shelves filled with children's art. Liana sat in silence, hands neatly placed on her lap, eyes fixed somewhere over the doctor's shoulder. She didn't fidget, she didn't flinch. But she didn't meet anyone halfway either. No eye contact, no gestures, no sound. So they tried someone else. A retired speech therapist, known for working with deeply withdrawn children. He brought puppets, flashcards, told funny stories with his hands. Liana watched quietly, like she was watching through glass. When he gently asked, "Would you like to try?" She just shook her head, picked up a colored pencil, and went back to her blank page. No one had ever seen her angry. No one had ever seen her cry. And somehow that hurt Rosa more than any outburst ever could, because it meant whatever lived inside Liana had retreated so far, it no longer wanted to be found. Still, Rosa didn't stop. Twice a week, every week, she drove over an hour each way for therapy sessions, sometimes skipping her nursing shifts, sometimes sitting in the car, in silence, for the entire hour while Liana sat in another room not speaking. Sometimes she caught herself wondering, was Liana punishing her? Was the silence meant for her? But Rosa pushed that thought away every time. She didn't believe her daughter was angry at anyone. She believed Liana was lost, somewhere too far for words, and just hadn't found the road back. At night, Rosa would slip into Liana's room, not to talk, not to fix, just to be there. She would sit beside the bed, breathe softly, stay long enough so Liana knew someone was still here. One night, she left a small note folded on the pillow. "You don't have to say a word. If you ever want me close, just touch my hand." In the morning, the note was still there, untouched. No crease, no fingerprint, as if the paper itself had been waiting all night for something that never came. But Rosa's heart didn't break because Liana wouldn't speak. It broke because it started to feel like she no longer wanted to be heard. And so the days kept passing, one soft silence folding into the next. Liana continued to live in her quiet world, a world with no voices, no explanations, no blame, just colors and lines, and the quiet labor of a little girl trying to stay afloat inside something that had taken too much from her. Rosa watched from a distance she couldn't name. Close enough to step in, far enough not to scare her away. And somehow, that fragile distance held everything they both had left. Rosa worked days in the ER, white coat over tired shoulders, hands steadied by habit even when her fingers trembled just pouring a glass of water. The job wore on her, always urgent, always loud. But every night, no matter how long the shift or how heavy the silence, Rosa would slip quietly into her daughter's room, like a breeze that didn't want to startle anything. She'd lay a warm cloth across Liana's forehead if the temperature dropped. Sit at the edge of the bed, like it was ritual. Not speaking, not forcing anything, just holding space. Some nights she simply held Liana's hand. The little girl never gripped back, never pulled away. But Rosa stayed anyway, for 30 minutes, for an hour, sometimes more. Just so her daughter would know, someone was still waiting, someone who didn't need words, didn't expect miracles, didn't even hope for a return. Just someone who would stay. As long as Liana was here and breathing, that was enough. Every evening, Rosa placed a warm mug of milk near the window where Liana always sat. One night, she forgot. The next morning, she found her daughter in the same spot, lips pale from the cold, still sketching in silence. Rosa never forgot again. From then on, she made sure the milk was ready by 9 p.m. sharp. Not to earn a thank you, not to coax a smile, just to keep hold of whatever thread was left, that small, delicate thread of connection her daughter hadn't let go of completely. Spring came late in Willow Creek. The snow took its time melting. But Rosa started to notice something change, quietly, like thawing earth. Liana was drawing more, not just gray skies and faceless mountains anymore. One day Rosa glanced over and froze. In the middle of a soft green field, under hints of sunlight, stood a dog. Not a cartoon, not a blur of color. This was detailed. Strong lines, focused eyes, a thick mane around the neck. The dog stood with quiet dignity, facing forward, not attacking, not running, just standing there, almost protective, like it was guarding something unseen just out of frame. Rosa didn't say anything. Not right then. But later that night, after tucking Liana into bed, she sat alone in the kitchen and opened her old phone. The screen flickered as she typed in a simple phrase, "Dogs and children with trauma." She scrolled past articles, forums, videos, until one set of words made her stop. Canine therapy. She didn't know what it was before, but the more she read, the more something inside her stirred, gently, like a forgotten song humming back to life. Story after story of children who couldn't speak, who couldn't connect, who started to open up again, all because of a dog. Research backed it too, showing how contact with therapy dogs helped reduce panic, restore trust, and even reignite language in children who had lost it. She read until past midnight, sometimes choking up, sometimes scribbling notes in the back of an old notebook, like she was afraid the hope might slip away again. Rosa didn't let herself believe anything too fast. But for the first time in months, there was a direction. Not a promise, but a path. A line through the fog. The next morning, Liana was in her usual spot, colored pencil in hand, a half-finished sketch in front of her. Rosa walked over, quiet. No questions, no requests. She placed her hand gently on the image of the dog and said, almost a whisper, "If there was a real dog that looked like this, do you think you'd like him?" Liana didn't answer, but her hand stopped moving. And Rosa knew that wasn't rejection. It was a pause, a listening, a door that wasn't locked. The very next day, Rosa sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and typed an email nearly 2 pages long. She sent it to a therapy dog training center in the next city, almost 80 miles away through mountain roads. In it, she poured out Liana's story, the silence that had lasted more than a year. The night they left home with nothing but a backpack and red umbrella. The drawing that appeared like a signal in the mist. She didn't beg. She didn't dramatize. She just wrote like a mother whose strength had been wrung out drop by drop, but who still had enough left to try one more thing. 4 days later, an email came. They said they'd need a video call to assess the situation, then a follow-up to review the home environment. That night, Rosa stayed up late cleaning every corner of the house. She laid a soft rug in the living room, removed anything that might make a sudden sound, placed a large floor cushion by the window, the one Liana always sat by. She didn't say a word to her daughter, just prepared everything in silence, like someone laying a path through the woods without knowing where it led. A week later, the snow had begun to melt. The pine trees outside whispered again, and a silver car rolled quietly to the top of Maple Street. From the driver's side, a woman stepped out, maybe in her 50s, composed but kind. Walking beside her was a German shepherd. His coat was a mix of charcoal and sand. He moved like a soldier just off duty, strong and grounded. But his eyes were still, deep and calm, like a summer lake that knew how to wait. "This is Orion," the woman said gently, as if introducing an old friend instead of a therapy dog. "He's not in a hurry, so we don't have to be either." Rosa gave a quiet nod and opened the front door. Orion didn't rush in, didn't bark, didn't sniff around like most dogs do in new places. He simply walked into the room with one deliberate step at a time. Then he laid down, right there in the middle of the living room, not close to Liana, but not far either. About 3 meters away, just enough to feel present, not invasive. Liana was sitting on the wooden chair by the window, her back to the door. She didn't turn around, didn't flinch. But her eyes, for the first time in over 18 months, they stopped drifting through things like they were invisible. They settled. Not on Rosa, not on the stranger in the room, but on Orion. Still, quiet, not asking for attention, just there. No one said anything. No one needed to. 15 minutes passed. Then Orion shifted. He turned slightly, gave a lazy stretch, and let out a soft yawn. He rested his head on his paws like he'd just found the one place in the world where he could take a deep breath. Something in the room changed. The silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt safe. Liana stared. Her hand still rested on a blank page. No new strokes, no sudden movements, but her eyes were alive, watching, staying, present. Behind her, Rosa stood by the edge of the chair, hand hovering on the wooden backrest, afraid to break the moment. Her heart, which had been pounding all week with hope and doubt, began to slow. This might not be a miracle, but it wasn't a void either. From that moment on, Liana's world wasn't a one-person world anymore. Orion had entered, not with a wagging tail, not with playful nudges or slobbery kisses. He didn't try to win her over. He just came in, chose a distance that honored her quiet, and stayed. As if he had always known, sometimes, what we need most isn't someone to say the right thing. It's someone willing to wait with us in the silence. In those first days, Orion never got too close. He moved like a quiet shadow behind Liana. When she went to the porch, he lay a few steps behind her. When she drew, he settled nearby, never touching her, never crowding. He didn't chase her affection, and that's exactly why she didn't push him away. They found a balance, fragile, but real. The first morning Orion stayed in the house, Rosa woke before the sun. She poured her coffee slowly, careful not to make a sound. Then she slipped out to the back porch, where Liana usually sat with her sketchbook. The sky was still dark. Mist draped over the pine roofs like a whisper, and at the bottom of the porch steps was Orion. Lying long, still, watchful, not guarding, just being there. Orion lay there quietly from the moment Liana stepped outside. He didn't move, didn't stare, just listened, his ears twitching softly each time a bird cut across the sky. A few steps away, Liana sat on the edge of the porch, sketchbook open, pencil in hand, her gaze occasionally drifting his way, then dropping back to the page. No one said hello. No one called anyone's name. But somehow, the morning didn't feel cold anymore. When Liana stood up and walked inside, Orion followed. Slowly, not crowding, never passing her. He stayed at that same thoughtful distance, like he had quietly measured every step between them and chosen not to take more than what she was willing to give. Down the hallway, into the kitchen, out to the back porch. Wherever Liana went, Orion was there, close enough to be felt, but never close enough to make her flinch. Rosa noticed it, day after day, the way Orion made no demands, the way he never tried to be the center of attention. He didn't perform, he didn't beg, he simply existed, present, patient, and whole. Like a steady heartbeat you only notice when everything else goes quiet. One afternoon, Liana was drawing at the edge of the pine forest behind their home. Orion rested a few feet behind her, just far enough to give her peace, close enough to leap if anything came too near. A branch snapped overhead and dropped just beside her. In a blink, Orion was on his feet, not barking, not growling, just standing, strong, still, directly between Liana and the open space in front of her. Liana didn't scream, didn't cry. She just looked at him. That look didn't say trust. It didn't say fear either. It simply said, "I see you." And that changed everything. The next day, Liana came out to the front steps and sat down. She didn't draw. She just sat there, hands resting quietly in her lap. Orion didn't climb the steps. He lay below, his chin resting on his paws, eyes calm and watching. For the first time, Liana looked at him, really looked, and didn't look away. 5 seconds passed, then 10, then longer. The kind of silence that feels full, not empty. Inside the kitchen, Rosa was rinsing dishes. She stopped mid-motion, held her breath, watched through the window. Then came something so small it would have been easy to miss. Liana bent down, picked up a green crayon that had fallen beside her, and placed it on the ground next to Orion. No words, no cues, just a gentle offering, like a whisper between two souls learning each other's language. Orion didn't snatch it up. He didn't wag, didn't lick her hand. He just looked at the crayon, then back at Liana. Then he lowered his head again and nudged his nose softly against the porch boards, as if to say, I received it. And that was enough. The crayon stayed there until nightfall. No one picked it up. From that day on, Liana's drawings started to change. Slowly, page by page. What used to be mist and shadow became outlines of something solid. First came the posture, then the ears, then the eyes. Not generic, not imagined, but his. Eyes that watched her every day without expecting anything in return. It wasn't a made-up dog anymore. It was Orion. He didn't do anything grand, didn't push for connection. He simply stayed. And sometimes, that's all healing needs. Not a hug, not a speech, not even a question. Just a quiet space where two hurt hearts can breathe beside each other without making the pain worse. One early summer evening, sunlight slanted through the front window and painted soft streaks of gold across the wooden floor. Rosa passed through the living room, a cup in her hand, a thought in her head when she saw it. Liana had fallen asleep at the table. Her hand still held a colored pencil. Her sketchbook lay open in front of her, halfway through a drawing. And underneath her feet, Orion was lying quietly, head resting gently against her ankle. Not pressing, not clinging, just resting there. Like he was saying, I'm still here, if you need me. Rosa froze. She didn't want to move, didn't want to break the moment. But the thing that truly made her breath catch was this. Liana didn't pull her leg away. Liana didn't flinch, didn't pull away. She kept sleeping, breathing softly. Her leg still resting where it was, as if she had grown used to Orion's presence. Maybe even accepted it. That night, Rosa opened a drawer and pulled out an old sketchbook, the one filled with drawings Liana made when she was 6. She went through the pages one by one, tracing each line like a memory she didn't want to lose. Back when Liana would sing in the kitchen while Rosa baked, when the house was full of color and noise and softness. Then Rosa looked at Liana's newer drawings, still her daughter's work, but different now. The pencil strokes weren't tight like they were holding in pain. They flowed more, softer. And there was something else too, something alive. A few days later, while Rosa was folding laundry in the bedroom, she heard Orion's paws padding down the hallway. Not fast, just steady enough to make the floorboards thump lightly beneath him. Then, the sound of leaves rustling. Rosa stepped into the doorway and stopped cold. Orion was chasing a red maple leaf dancing in the wind. Liana stood nearby, not laughing, not clapping, but her lips curved ever so slightly, like a petal unfolding in sunlight. A real smile, software unforced, and the way the light touched her eyes, barely a flicker, was enough to make Rosa place a hand over her heart, holding back a rush of something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Hope. Later that evening, Rosa found a new drawing left on the desk. Not hidden, not folded over like all the others had been. It was a picture of Orion, sitting in a green meadow, tall pine trees behind him, sunlight pouring through the branches in warm golden beams. His fur was colored with care, shades of gray and soft brown, detailed as if every strand had been studied closely. But the most moving part wasn't Orion himself. Next to him were a pair of small legs, not a full person, just the lower part, just enough. Enough to know that Liana had drawn herself into the picture, She had given herself a place beside him. For the first time in nearly 2 years, Rosa didn't walk into her daughter's room to coax or fix or hope for signs. She just sat on the edge of the bed, quietly. Liana didn't speak, but she didn't pull away either. She kept drawing, her neck tilted, her hand steady, her focus soft but real. Orion lay at the foot of the bed, head resting on his front paws, eyes half closed. 3 beings, in one room, no one asking for change. And somehow everyone was changing. Rosa didn't expect Liana to speak tomorrow, or run into her arms, or paint rainbows and flowers like before. She didn't need that. Not anymore. As long as Liana kept drawing, as long as Orion kept lying nearby, as long as that quiet smile, like a drifting leaf, returned now and then to her daughter's face. That was more magical than any medicine Rosa had ever known. Orion hadn't been trained for this. Not specifically. No one had taught him how to live inside this home. He hadn't been given new commands. But somehow, he always seemed to know when to walk toward her, when to lie still, when to let his gaze linger just a bit longer. If Liana went outside early, Orion followed, never rushing. If she paused beneath the old pine tree, Orion lay a few steps away, close enough to stand if needed, far enough not to crowd what she hadn't yet put into words. When the wind blew too hard and startled Liana, Orion didn't bark, didn't jump. He just lifted his head, turned slightly and watched her. And in that look, there was no fear, no question, just a quiet promise. You're not alone. One time, Rosa gently called Orion into another room while Liana sat on the porch. Orion stood, padded a few steps, then stopped at the threshold. He turned, looked at Rosa with calm, steady eyes, then walked back and lay down, right where Liana could still feel him near. Orion returned to his usual spot without hesitation. No resistance, no refusal, just a clear choice. Liana was there, and Orion wasn't ready to leave. In the mornings that followed, Liana no longer sat by the window alone. She started opening the door earlier, sometimes even before Rosa was up. Orion knew the routine. He was always waiting, patient and calm. No head nudges, no hand licking, no demands. Just sitting there, like a soft, steady rhythm of the world itself. Though she never said it aloud, Liana began to wait. Not impatiently, not anxiously, but always watching, always noticing if Orion hadn't appeared yet. Her eyes no longer empty. They found a place to rest. And whenever Orion stepped into view, that gaze softened, slowed, like the missing part of her had finally found its way back home. Some afternoons, Rosa saw Liana open her sketchbook and place Orion nearby. Then she'd sit quietly for hours. No coloring, no writing. But just having Orion close like that, natural, unafraid, was an unspoken trust, full and enough. The friendship between Liana and Orion didn't need words, didn't need explanations. It showed in how Orion rested his head on the floor when Liana felt sad, in how she looked for him before falling asleep, and in the slow, sure strokes she used when drawing his gray fur again, this time with a small scarf loosely tied around his neck. No one forced Liana to open up. But Orion opened that door with patience and silence. A quiet friendship, simple and clear, had begun. And Rosa knew this. Sometimes the greatest change doesn't come from shocks or upheaval, but from waking up each morning knowing someone is still there and isn't going anywhere. That afternoon, Rosa had just stepped inside the house, her shoes still on, when a pale yellow envelope lying on the table made her heart skip a beat. The postmark stamped in bright red ink, The bold, official lettering across the front read, "Summons Notice, Jefferson County Family Court." Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The letter was just one page, but every line felt like a weight pressing against her chest. Alan, Liana's biological father, had filed for custody reconsideration. In his petition, he accused Rosa of intentionally isolating their daughter from her father, denying visitation rights, and even interfering with the child's psychological recovery. The kitchen suddenly felt colder, despite the fire crackling in the hearth. Rosa sank down into a chair, clutching the letter she couldn't put down. She had known this day would come, Alan's return, but not like this. Liana appeared at her bedroom door, clutching her sketchbook. She looked at her mother but said nothing. Her eyes caught the word court peeking from the edge of the paper. Slowly, her gaze drifted to the name, Alan Holloway. 4 simple words, but enough to make her small legs freeze in place. That night, Liana did not sleep. She didn't cry, didn't struggle. She simply lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling for hours. Rosa sat beside her in silence. Orion rested quietly beneath the bed, his ears twitching with every turn Liana made. But he never left his place. Every breath she took, short or tight, Orion felt with a focus no human lesson could teach. At 3 a.m, Liana suddenly rose and stepped down from the bed. Orion rose immediately, following without a word or signal. Liana walked out onto the porch where the chill of May still lingered. Orion stayed close, but never stepped ahead. She stood there, arms wrapped around herself. Orion sat nearby, not touching, just tilting his head, eyes fixed on the darkness as if waiting for her to share what she saw in the thick night. Rosa watched from inside, her heart aching. She knew the silent fear was returning. This time she couldn't stop it with hugs or soothing words, but Rosa had Orion, and she believed Orion knew what to do. The next morning, Rosa called her lawyer, her voice steady now, no longer shaking. She explained the situation, requested extended leave from work. She knew this was no longer just a legal matter. It was a battle to protect a child who had never found her own voice. When Rosa contacted the therapy center, she confirmed Orion would accompany Liana to court, not as evidence, but as a friend. A 4-legged friend who understood Liana better than anyone ever had. That morning, Rosa woke before the first light. The small wooden house lay silent, broken only by the whispering wind and the soft footsteps of Orion padding from Liana's room into the hall. He seemed to know this day was unlike any other. Rosa opened the closet and selected a gentle gray knit dress for her daughter. Simple, modest, without patterns. Quietly, she folded and placed beside it a cream-colored scarf Liana had once picked out during an early spring market trip. Back then, Liana had smiled, a rare, bright smile Rosa remembered like sunlight warming her hand. Rosa didn't ask if Liana wanted to wear it. She simply laid it on the bedside table beside her daughter's familiar sketchbook. The choice was Liana's. At dawn, Liana emerged, quietly changing into the dress. Without prompting, she wrapped the scarf around her neck, slow, deliberate, with quiet certainty. Orion waited by the door, wearing his polished therapy dog tag on a leather collar. His stance was still, his tail still, as if he understood today required calm like never before. The car pulled away at 7:15. Outside, the pine trees held on to their dark green. Thin wisps of mist crawled across the windshield like delicate fingers stretching through the silence inside the vehicle. Rosa drove with eyes fixed ahead, but often glanced in the rearview mirror to see Liana sitting straight, hands resting quietly on her lap. Silent. Only one thing reassured Rosa she was not alone in this journey. Liana's hand rested lightly on Orion's back. Not gripping, not clinging, just a soft touch, like a habit or a lifeline, something to keep her tethered to this world. Orion didn't react. He breathed steady and calm. His eyes weren't closed, but they didn't gaze out the window like they usually did. He simply sat there, like a shield against the cold wind, a silent roof sheltering Liana, enough to make her feel safe. When the car arrived at the courthouse grounds, the atmosphere shifted. Tall buildings loomed, their cold concrete walls standing firm. Flags fluttered stiffly in the early morning breeze. Few people passed by, but all hurried with serious faces. Rosa parked at the entrance, reserved for guests with special summonses. She stepped out first, walking around to open the door for Liana. Liana stepped down, her hand lightly resting on Orion's neck. The courthouse doors swung open, releasing the scent of paper, floor wax, and the nameless odor of years of tangled battles. Rosa moved slowly, but with purpose. Liana walked beside her. Orion, without being told, matched their pace, walking close without a leash. The security guards glanced at Orion's therapy dog tag and nodded. "He's allowed in," one said. Rosa whispered a soft thanks. Liana said nothing, but squeezed the scarf tighter. Orion glanced briefly at her, just a flicker, then kept moving. Down the long hallway toward the courtroom, the three of them, a mother, a daughter, and a German shepherd, moved as one. No one led, no one followed. Their steps were perfectly synchronized, like a breath they had practiced together over months of silent understanding. Rosa knew that whatever awaited behind that wooden door, at least they were stepping through it together. But the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, dragging out the waiting. The polished gray tiles reflected the overhead lights in muted echoes, each footstep ringing out like a sound from a half-remembered dream. No one spoke. No one needed to. And then he appeared. Alan, in a sharp black vest, shiny leather shoes, a neatly tied charcoal gray tie, his face unreadable, eyes not softening for even a moment as they swept the hallway. Not once did he look at his daughter. His first glance wasn't for Liana. It was for Rosa. A cold look, sharp like metal scraping glass. Not anger, not sadness, just a challenge wrapped in the guise of civility. Rosa didn't respond. She turned her shoulder just enough to shield Liana, a familiar reflex she'd never forgotten in all these years. Liana took a small step back. So slight it could have been missed. But Orion saw it. No one had taught Orion how to react in moments like this. No command, no special training for a courthouse hallway where a father's presence felt like an old, unhealed scar. But Orion stepped forward. Half his body quietly moved to stand between Liana and Alan. No growling, no raised hackles, no attention-seeking behavior. He simply stood there, a warm barrier made of presence and calm. Liana looked down. Her hand, moments before relaxed, clenched tight into a fist. Fingers squeezed together, white at the knuckles. Rosa saw it and opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, Orion did the only thing he needed to do. He pressed his head gently against that fist. No nudging, no pressure. Just a soft touch, enough to say, "Orion is here." Liana didn't cry. She didn't pull away. She just stood there, her face unusually calm, but her wide-open eyes quietly holding on to something inside that threatened to break. No one said a word. Then the courtroom door opened. A court clerk called out their names, Rosa, Liana, and Alan. Orion was allowed in as a registered therapy dog. Eyes glanced their way as the dog walked into the family court hearing, but no one laughed. No whispers. Maybe, somehow, They sensed something was coming in with those three. Rosa walked in first. Orion followed closely in the middle. Liana stayed just behind, her hand relaxed but still lightly touching the fur on Orion's back, a silent thread connecting one heartbeat to another. The courtroom air was heavy and serious. Yet through it all, Orion's steps stayed steady. None of the three spoke, but that profound, calm silence was the clearest message of all. Orion was holding the breath of a small heart, struggling against fear. Time seemed to freeze as Alan was called to speak first. He stepped up to the podium in a crisp black suit, his tie neatly knotted like a smooth mask, hiding what was really coming. He stood tall, eyes steady, voice clear, like he had rehearsed every word 100 times inside his head. "I am Liana's biological father," Alan began slowly, with a fake politeness. "I have never, and will never, harm my daughter." He paused, letting each word settle, then continued, his tone sharpening with bitterness. "The only thing standing between me and my daughter is Rosa. She has deliberately kept us apart, denied every meeting, every message, every chance for reconciliation, and now she uses my daughter's silence as a weapon to slander me." Rosa's hands clenched tight in her lap, but she didn't respond. Instead, her eyes shifted toward Liana, who remained still in her chair, hands folded calmly in her lap. Orion lay close beside her, head slightly tilted toward her, unmoving. "And I want to make this clear to the court." Alan's voice hardened, sharp as ice. "A child who doesn't speak isn't necessarily afraid. Sometimes they're being controlled, made to believe a lie." His words echoed through the courtroom like cold smoke slipping into every crevice between the benches. A few people in the audience furrowed their brows. Some glanced toward Liana. Rosa's lawyer rose immediately to object. She cited old hospital records, psychological reports, and the nearly 2 years of ongoing recovery. But what the lawyer could not produce was Liana's own voice. "In closing, Your Honor," Alan said, "I only want what's rightfully mine, the right to be a father. No one can take that away from me, not even the silence of a child who doesn't fully understand." He turned away, sitting down without so much as a glance at his daughter. Liana pulled her shoulders slightly inward, as if being dragged back to months she couldn't name. Rosa reached out instinctively, then stopped herself. Orion didn't hesitate. He nudged his head up, resting it gently on the edge of Liana's chair, brushing her knee, then lay still again. The judge bent over the files, reading carefully, then looked up. His voice was calm, neither cold nor soft, but utterly fair. "Liana Riker," he said, "you may say whatever you wish. No one will force you. But now is the time to share your feelings, in your own way, if you are ready." Silence fell once more, broken only by the gentle rotation of the ceiling fan. Rosa glanced at Liana, not with expectation but with trust, as if knowing that whether Liana spoke or not, her worth was already known. But Liana's eyes were on Orion. Her gaze didn't tremble. No tears glistened, just a small, steady light, flickering but unwavering, like she was searching for answers not in her head, but in another soul. Orion blinked, didn't nod, didn't bark. He simply waited. And in that moment, something strange began to grow. It felt as if no one was waiting for words, but for a signal from somewhere quieter, deeper, and more real. Liana lowered her hand to the floor, softly. Orion immediately turned, sat upright. She looked at the judge, then bent down, brushing her pinky finger gently against Orion's back. A touch. No one in the courtroom understood what it meant. But Orion did. and no one could have guessed what was about to happen would completely change the air in this room that had been too still for too long. Liana sat behind the microphone, its height reaching her chin. Her back didn't rest against the chair. The chair was much too big for her small frame. The room seemed to shrink with every breath. All eyes were fixed on the little girl with tousled brown hair and hands folded quietly in her lap. Rosa sat a few rows back in the audience. Her fingers clenched the edge of her skirt, her gaze never leaving her daughter, so small, yet alone, facing a room full of adults, including her biological father just a few steps away. Across the room, Alan's face showed no emotion. He tilted his head slightly, propping his chin on his hand, as if waiting for a play to unfold. Nothing more, nothing less. The female judge, her voice low and steady, her eyes serious but not cold, spoke gently. "You don't have to speak if it scares or bothers you. If you want, you can write or do whatever makes it easier. No one here will force you." Liana didn't answer, but her shoulders moved slightly. Her eyes didn't meet the judge, nor Alan, nor the lawyers. She glanced briefly at Rosa. Then her gaze settled on Orion. Orion lay quietly beside the witness stand, head neatly resting on his front paws. He hadn't moved or made a sound since the hearing began. But when Liana's eyes met his, something was silently passed between them. Slowly, Liana raised her hand. Very slowly. Every movement deliberate. She placed her left hand over her chest and curled her pinky finger into a small circle. A simple gesture, one only those who truly knew her would understand. A signal. The signal Rosa and Orion had practiced with Liana for months. A way to communicate without words. A message of trust. As soon as the signal was made, Orion rose. No command, no growl, no loud noise. Just a single bark. Sharp, clear, neither long nor repeated. But that bark cut through the suffocating silence in the courtroom like a hammer striking thick glass that had trapped Liana's heart for nearly 2 years. Some spectators gasped and leaned forward. The judge slightly raised her head. Alan's lawyer furrowed his brow. But Rosa simply closed her eyes, then opened them again. She understood. Orion walked slowly toward Liana, not rushing, not noisy, just each step steady and soft, as if even the click of his nails against the floor might shatter the fragile light beginning to flicker inside the girl. Orion stood beside Liana and gently rested his head on her shoulder. The fur on Orion's cheek brushed softly against her sleeve, a touch that neither demanded nor pleaded, simply was. Present. And strangely, Liana didn't pull away. She let her shoulder rest. Her hand rose and gently settled on Orion's head, just like she did on those sleepless nights. A few whispers fluttered through the room. The judge raised a hand, signaling for silence. But she said nothing more, because she understood what had just happened carried more weight than any argument. A small signal, a single bark, one response. Orion didn't need to say more. His still presence, his steady gaze, the gentle pressure of his head against her, that was the clearest proof Liana had chosen to tell her story. Not with words, but with trust. And Rosa knew, for the first time in 18 months, her daughter wasn't just listening to the world. She was beginning to answer it back. The court had yet to declare anything, but in the hearts of a mother, a loyal dog, and the girl herself, something had shifted, and there was no going back. The only sounds now were the soft wind slipping through a high window crack, and the quiet scratch of pen on paper as the court clerk took notes. Every gaze held steady on the witness stand, where Liana sat, hands folded neatly in her lap, head bowed slightly, but back still straight. No one laughed, no one whispered. Even the defense attorney, usually so composed, holding the power, looked momentarily unsettled. His eyes flicked swiftly between Liana and Rosa before settling on Orion. Perhaps for the first time, he realized, not every child could be controlled, especially when they had a dog by their side who couldn't be bought. Orion remained beside Liana, still, unthreatening. But his eyes, bright and calm, stared forward, guarding an invisible line between truth and falsehood. No one had taught Orion to do that, yet somehow he always seemed to know when to speak and when to simply stand firm. The judge lifted his head, removed his glasses, and sat up straighter. That signal. What does it mean? His voice was quiet, but carried clear and serious. Rosa stood. Though her heart felt tangled and torn, her voice came steady, strong as stone. Your Honor, that's how my daughter signals when she feels scared, when she can't speak but still wants to say, something isn't right. No one interrupted. No objections, no gavel bangs or disputes, just stunned silence as everyone realized. A child who had been silent for 18 months had just chosen to speak in her own way. And a dog, who couldn't speak, had become the most faithful translator of that heart. The judge glanced toward the defense lawyer. The man cleared his throat, opened his mouth as if to speak, then sat back down. Perhaps even he understood. Any words now would only make the truth clearer. Liana still didn't lift her head. But Rosa didn't need to see her eyes clearly to know that gaze was no longer fleeing. And that small hand, though not raised high, gripped tightly beside Orion. A silent declaration. I am no longer silent. Orion gently nudged his head against Liana's shoulder, as if praising her for having just crossed an invisible cliff. No one had commanded Orion. No gesture was unnecessary. But in that simple act was everything: love, protection, and trust. Though the court had not declared a verdict, somewhere deep in the heart of a mother, a loyal dog, and a little girl, the trial had truly begun. The truth was unfolding. Rosa rose slowly. In her hands was a worn leather briefcase, edges faded from countless openings and closings. No files, no legal documents inside, just a carefully folded portfolio of drawings, page by page. Your Honor, Rosa's voice was soft but sure. I ask permission to present supplementary evidence, not words, not documents, but what my daughter has drawn over the past 6 months. The judge nodded. Silence filled the courtroom for a moment. Rosa stepped forward, laying the drawings one by one on the table like a traveler tracing memories, not with recollection, but with each brushstroke. The first drawing, a room. Gray pencil shades suffused everything. In the corner, a little girl curled up, arms wrapped around knees, face turned to the wall. Nearby, a tipped-over chair, and the shadow of a large, rough man standing with clenched fists. The second, a table. Beneath it, 2 small feet curled tightly, toes pressed together as if trying to shrink away from the ground. On the tabletop, frantic marks, crossed lines, scratches, as if hurriedly drawn to push away a feeling. And peeking out from beneath, a pair of hastily sketched eyes, alert and watchful. The third, a different room, lighter in tone. The girl still there, this time standing behind a slightly open door. Between her and the looming figure of the man stood a dog. No name, no face, just a familiar silhouette, its back arched like a shield. Rosa's hand rested on Orion's shoulder. He didn't move, but his eyes never left Liana. Liana looked back. No words, but her blinking was slower than before. The fourth, an almost abstract image, No clear lines, but bold colors, reds, oranges, blacks, bleeding like unnamed emotions. At the center was a strange shape, like a rough, distorted hand raised in the void. Below it a circle with 3 points, a mother with outstretched arms, a little girl hiding behind, and Orion standing in front, fur bristled, eyes black as coal. No one spoke, only the soft turning of pages, like wind brushing across an old book. Rosa faced the judge. Liana doesn't speak, but she draws, not to accuse, but to free herself. Those words made the man in the black vest across the room lean back slightly, no longer as confident as before. He lowered his gaze, but no one paid him any mind now. Each drawing was a night Orion lay beside her. Each sketch, a moment she woke up, wrapped her arms around his neck, then picked up her pencil again. No one told her what to draw, but Orion always seemed to know when to stay still, and when to rest his head on her hand, steadying the trembling pencil. The portfolio ended with a large drawing, softer colors, clearer lines. A house. A mother standing with arms wide open. Orion still stood guard in front. And behind them, faint but unmistakable, the shadow of a man, turned away, arm raised, his face empty, as if erased from the child's memory. "She doesn't need to say anything," Rosa whispered, "because it's all here on these pages." Liana didn't look at anyone, but she reached out, gently placing her hand on Orion's back, just as she always did before picking up her pencil. And in that moment, in a room full of adults struggling to find words, a dog lay quietly. No barking, no movement, because everything that needed to be heard was already there, on paper, in silence, and in the eyes of a child, finally finding a way to speak the pain she carried inside. No voice needed. No tears. Just that steady gaze, unwavering, unflinching, staring straight at the man she hadn't dared face for 2 years. The lawyer across the room smiled softly, a practiced smile of one trying to maintain control. "Drawing is how many children imagine things," he said. "Psychologically, this could simply be a mixture of emotions and fantasy." Rosa didn't respond immediately. She stayed seated, eyes locked on Liana. Then she nodded gently, as if she had expected that answer. And she opened a second portfolio, this time official documents, stamped in red, signed, dated clearly. "I agree children have rich imaginations," Rosa said, her voice calm and steady. "But some things can't be imagined unless they've been lived." She pulled out the first paper. A medical report from a March night 3 years ago. A bruise on Liana's left forearm, photographed and meticulously documented by doctors. Its location, shape, and severity. The crescent-shaped bruise matched perfectly the dark pencil stroke in Liana's second drawing. "That drawing is accurate. That night I tried to stop him, and this is the proof." The courtroom grew heavier. No more smiles. The opposing lawyer tried to interrupt. "This bruise can't conclusively determine the cause, but Rosa played a recording, not long, just 15 seconds. A scream, clear and desperate, echoing through the night from a neighbor's security camera. Then a door slamming hard, and a growl, words unclear, but unmistakably angry. The clip cut abruptly. The timestamp matched exactly the night Rosa had testified about. The judge furrowed his brow. Silence fell. No one dared call it imagination anymore. Orion sat beside Liana, eyes never leaving her. Rosa turned and pointed to a small map, the neighbor's camera location, just one wall away from their house. "I didn't want to use this," Rosa said, her voice trembling for the first time. "I hoped everything would pass if I stayed silent. But Liana can't carry that silence forever. Neither can I." For the first time, Alan lowered his head. No more smiles. No more arguments. His fists clenched the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Lyanna still said nothing, but this time she didn't bow her head. She looked straight ahead, unblinking, unflinching. And in that gaze, something she had never dared name before was slowly becoming clear. Orion nudged her shoulder softly, a reminder. She wasn't alone. People might deny the testimony, they might defend the actions, but no one could deny the consistency between a child's drawings and the concrete evidence, between what was drawn from a heart and what happened on that dark night. The portfolio was no longer just drawings. It became a record of things no one dared speak aloud, but that never disappeared. And the look in those brown eyes was the first declaration of a child learning to trust that truth, however late, deserves to be heard. The judge called for a 1-hour recess. The reason was brief: review of supplementary evidence. But for those in the heavy room, they understood. This break was time for the silent truth to settle in everyone's mind. Lyanna sat on a bench in the hallway. Her back rested against Rosa's shoulder, her hand placed gently on Orion's soft, warm fur, like an old knitted blanket on the coldest nights. Orion didn't move an inch away. His eyes didn't close, but neither were they alert. Just soft enough to let Lyanna know that, if needed, he was still there. Rosa stroked her daughter's hair gently. Her hands were soft but trembling. Not from fear, from relief. The relief of someone finally hearing what had been held deep in their heart for so long. A court officer, a guardian ad litem, approached quietly. The woman bent down gently, voice low, without judgment. "The child really doesn't speak?" Rosa looked up, eyes full of both exhaustion and resolve. "She does speak, just not with words." The woman paused for a moment, then slowly nodded. In her hands was a copy of the portfolio. The scribbles, raw and unpolished, yet alive and suffocating in their truth. Some drawings were just a few black pencil strokes, but heavy enough to make you hold your breath. Others were full of color, every shade placed with strange precision. Orion appeared on every page, like a witness who never sleeps. When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed. Not loud, not obvious, but something had tilted, just enough for people to look at each other differently. Alan no longer looked at Lyanna, nor at Rosa. His eyes flicked instead to his lawyer, then stopped on empty hands. Nothing left to hold, no words strong enough to say. The judge returned. Before him lay a large print, Lyanna's final drawing, a mother with arms wide open, Orion standing guard in front, and behind them, a father, hand raised high, but no face, only a shadow. No one needed to explain, everyone understood. Though the judge had not yet banged the gavel, Rosa squeezed her daughter's hand tight. Orion sat beside them, his head tilted slightly, as if listening for a sound no one else could hear. Lyanna didn't smile, but her lips curved slightly. Just a breath's worth, like an exhale after holding one for too long. In that moment, no words were needed, because silence alone was proof, and a dog who had never learned to speak was the first to help them understand. Truth sometimes comes not in words, but in a look, a drawing, and a single bark, right time, right place, to the right ears. Orion gently pressed his head against Lyanna's shoulder. Not to comfort, but to confirm. The truth, at last, had spoken. The hearing resumed after the recess. The air remained tense, like water on the edge of a storm. But something was different. Orion no longer lay beneath the chair. He sat upright beside Lyanna, his back straight, eyes fixed on the girl. Every time Liana inhaled deeply, Orion shifted just slightly, as if steadying her breath with his steadfast presence. The judge glanced down at the portfolio, then looked toward Liana. His voice was husky, but not cold. "Do you have something you want to say?" The question hung in the air. Everyone seemed to hold their breath. Liana sat still, eyes on the microphone in front of her. Orion didn't move. Rosa squeezed her daughter's hand softly under the table. A moment passed. Then Liana leaned forward. Her hand moved to Orion's head. A familiar touch, practiced over long winters, silent mornings, and nights spent holding each other close on cold pillows. Orion nudged his head gently, eyes never leaving the girl. And for the first time, Liana spoke. Just one sentence, soft as the wind, but enough to almost stop the entire courtroom. "Orion knows who makes me feel safe." Her voice was soft, barely clear, not high, not sharp, but steady, unshaken, no stumbles, no prompting needed. Just a simple sentence, heavy with the weight of 5 long months of silence. 5 months where she couldn't speak at all. The defense lawyer shifted slightly in his chair. Alan turned his head, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. But Rosa didn't doubt. She shivered lightly and squeezed her daughter's hand, not too hard, not pushing, just enough to say, "I'm here. I will always be here." The judge nodded quietly and flipped through more pages of the case file. No one pressured Liana to say more. No one forced her to choose her words. But the most important thing had been said. The court officer leaned toward Rosa, whispering, "It's been a long time since I've seen a dog respond so precisely. It's like he knows how important this is." Rosa's eyes never left her daughter as she replied, "Because Orion does know. He's there every time she's afraid. Orion is living proof." A moment later, Orion slowly turned his head. He didn't bark, didn't lift a paw. He only tilted his head and gently rested it on Liana's chest. And Liana, after a year of hiding, after countless nights swallowed by silence, quietly leaned her head against Orion's back. No one told her to. No script, no rehearsed moment. Just a little girl, finally, choosing not to hide anymore. Orion stayed still, his back steady, like a warm wall. No looking back, no whining. He simply breathed in, then out, slow and deep, as if offering her a heartbeat strong enough to hold on to, in the thick tension filling the room. Liana's hand brushed lightly through Orion's fur. Her fingers trembled a little, but that movement held a courage beyond words. She didn't look at the judge, didn't look at her father. Her gaze settled on something hazy ahead, as if looking deep inside herself. Then, in the stillness that seemed endless, a soft voice broke the silence. "Orion knows who makes me safe." Her voice was small, dry, choked at the end, but clear enough for every person in the room to hear. Rosa burst into tears. No sobs, no noise, just tears falling like unexpected rain. Her hand dropped the tissue and quickly grasped the chair arm, as if letting go of her grip would cause her to shatter along with the flood of emotions. Alan's lawyer froze. The man who had been confident moments ago leaned forward, disbelief etched across his face. Alan turned away, his fists clenched tight, trembling in a way he couldn't control. The judge didn't write anything down immediately. He just looked at Liana, long and steady. In that gaze, there was no doubt, no obligation, only the look of someone who had just witnessed something sacred and undeniable. Orion didn't move. He simply closed his eyes softly, as if he knew his task was done. No further explanation was needed. Liana kept her head bowed, But this time, she didn't shy away. She leaned into Orion as if resting on a memory never spoken aloud, now coming alive through her small, fragile voice. A court supervisor quietly asked, "Could you repeat that?" Liana remained silent. After a moment, she didn't answer with words. Instead, she placed her hand over her chest, then gently pressed it against Orion's neck. The gesture was simple, without flourish or explanation, but carried a clarity deeper than any sentence. Rosa saw it and nodded. She understood. They had practiced this signal countless times, through sleepless nights, through sunlit afternoons when not a sound stirred the house. It was how her daughter said, "This is the truth." The judge raised his hand to signal no need to continue. He leaned back in his chair, eyes still fixed on the small girl who had just used her fragile voice to open the first door out of darkness. Orion kept his eyes closed. The fur on his back rose and fell with each of Liana's breaths. The room was silent, but no longer filled with doubt. Instead, it held respect. Respect for a child who dared to speak the truth she had carried for so many years. And in that moment, inside a courtroom that had felt frozen, the warmest thing appeared. Not from a lawyer's mouth, not from a judge's gavel, but from the heart of a little girl, and the silent, powerful presence of a dog named Orion. The judge exhaled softly. No need for conferences, no need for more arguments. On the table lay the portfolio. Beside it, the recording from the neighbor. And before him, a child who had learned to speak not with anger, but with trust. He turned to Alan. The man's shoulders sagged. His face hardened, not in defiance, but in recognition that everything was clear now. Nothing left to deny, and no one in the room believed he should be near that child again. The judge spoke slowly, without repetition. Custody and guardianship of Liana Riker are hereby granted permanently to Rosa Elena. His voice was calm, never harsh, but every word rang out clearly, like a decisive bell breaking the silence. All visitation rights of Alan Ruiz are suspended indefinitely, pending clear evidence of psychological improvement and safety on his part. A few people in the room nodded quietly. The child protection officer took notes, but a small, relieved smile tugged at the corner of her lips. The judge paused for a moment, then looked toward Orion. This German Shepherd therapy dog, based on assessments from child behavior specialists, medical records, and courtroom observations, shall be recognized as an essential part of the child's recovery process. He provides a unique therapeutic effect and is to be protected as an inseparable element in the child's best interests. Orion didn't understand the words. But when Rosa's hand stroked along his spine, he stretched slowly, arching like a warrior who had just completed his mission. Liana remained still, her hand resting softly on Orion's neck. When the judge finished his declaration, she rose slowly, neither hurried nor hesitant. She didn't look at her father, nor at anyone else. She simply grasped the edge of the scarf loosely tied around Orion's neck, a corner Rosa had sewn so Liana could touch it whenever she needed to feel safe. And just like that, two shadows, a girl and a dog, quietly left the courtroom. No applause, no tears of tragedy, only steady footsteps and a calm breath that spread through the rows of seats. Everyone stood silently. No one spoke. But everyone understood. A miracle had just happened. And that miracle did not come from a legal victory, nor from accusations or defenses. It came from a gentle touch on a dog's neck, a first spoken word, and the gaze of a little girl, finally finding a place where she was truly safe. A dog had brought the truth into the light. And his name was Orion. 6 months passed since the hearing. Autumn returned to the small town nestled by the forest, where the trees whispered in the language of the wind. Leaves turned golden, then red, softly falling onto the weathered wooden roof of the house Rosa rented after gaining custody of Liana. The house was neither large nor fancy, but sunlight poured through the windows every morning. The old gas stove hissed and popped warmly in the kitchen. A soft rug lay where Orion curled up each evening. Outside, a simple wooden porch held a folding table and a box of watercolor paints that Liana still used each morning. Just beyond the porch stood an ancient tree, rough bark, branches spreading wide like giant protective arms. It was there that Liana sat, legs crossed on a raised root, a small wooden board resting on her knees, pencil in hand, drawing. Each morning she took her place like a silent ritual, a child learning to come back to the world. Orion lay at her feet, head resting lightly on her pant leg, eyes half closed, as if guarding her dreams. Every time Liana bent to add another line, Orion's ears twitched, and he let out a soft breath as if to say, "Keep going. Nothing here will scare you anymore." No one taught Liana how to heal. No one forced her to smile, to speak, or to become a normal child quickly. But in that quiet moment, with Orion lying beside her, something was slowly coming back to life. Beneath the old tree, Liana drew a circle, then carefully added 2 pointed ears, a slow, steady kind of healing that truly worked. She no longer covered her ears when distant dogs barked. Sometimes she softly hummed a line from the song her mother played every morning. It wasn't quite the tune. Not all the words clear. But every time, Rosa, standing in the kitchen, would pause mid-stir, eyes filling with gratitude. And a quiet ache. Because she knew, to reach this moment of peace, her daughter had traveled through too much pain. From the kitchen window, Rosa watched silently. Orion's eyes never left Liana. Sometimes he'd lift a paw, as if to touch the ground near her feet. Sometimes he sighed deeply, steady and sure. The wind stirred, swirling dry leaves around the 2 small figures. One golden, one dark, one child, one dog. Between them, no words were needed. No reasons, only presence, as if for a long time Orion had known, just lying there quietly was enough for her to keep drawing. And when she drew, it meant she was coming back to life, bit by bit. Passers-by might not notice the miracle unfolding on that simple porch, but to Rosa, who had watched her daughter curl up like a dry leaf in winter, that tree by the porch was the earliest sunrise. Not in the sky, but in the eyes of a little girl who smiled for the first time without being told. And it was all thanks to a dog named Orion. In the early days of their new life, Liana still spoke little. But Rosa never forced her. They communicated through glances, soft squeezes of hands passing in the hallway, and little notes Liana began writing each afternoon. At first, the words were scattered and often misspelled. But Rosa didn't correct them. She only smiled, nodded gently, and carefully taped each note to the kitchen wall, right where the morning sun poured in through the window. The first note read, "Sunlight." The second, "Window." The third had a shaky pencil sketch of a little dog, underneath, a simple word, "Friend." Rosa read each word like a poem. She didn't ask why Liana wrote them, nor did she press her to explain any drawing in the sketchbook. Rosa knew that for Liana, every word was a great effort, each carrying a part of the feelings she had held inside for so long. That day, the sun was soft and warm. The air smelled of dry leaves and peeled orange peels someone left at the end of the street. Orion lay on the wooden floor near the garden door. He stretched his legs, then suddenly jumped up and ran outside, chasing something invisible to others. When he returned, a large fallen leaf was in his mouth, bright red-orange, edges slightly curled, still catching the light like it had been painted with beeswax. Orion came over and gently placed the leaf at Liana's feet. No bark, no excited tail wag. Just a quiet gesture, laying the leaf down, head tilted slightly, eyes watching her reaction. Liana bent down to look at the leaf. 1 beat, 2 beats, then she laughed. The laugh was short, not loud, but clear and bright, like tiny glass bells gently clinking in the breeze. Rosa was washing dishes in the kitchen, her hand frozen mid-wipe. She paused for a moment, then almost ran to the porch. No words, no questions. She simply knelt down and pulled both Liana and Orion into a warm embrace. Orion closed his eyes. One of Liana's hands still held the leaf. The other wrapped around Orion's neck, her head resting lightly on Rosa's shoulder. No one spoke of the past. No one said, "You're so brave," or "You've made it through." Just 3 circles, an adult, a child, and a dog, holding each other under the warm midday sun, like honey slowly dripping over the porch wall. That evening, in her sketch diary, Liana drew a simple picture. 3 circles touching beneath a tree. 1 large circle with flowing hair. 1 smaller circle with hair tied in pigtails. And the last circle, 2 pointed ears, drawn boldly in black ink. No words, no explanation. But Rosa only needed to look to understand. It was their family, in the first moment they truly laughed together after everything. Above the 3 circles, Liana added a few strokes. A leafy canopy, some yellow leaves, and 1 word, scrawled roughly. Today. Not before. Not that day. But today. And today Orion still lay guarding Liana's sleep beneath sunlight streaming through the window, as if knowing, as long as he was there, she would keep writing her own story. Night fell earlier than usual. The small town by the forest was wrapped in the gentle stillness of late autumn. No wind, no mist, just an unnamed calm, like someone had placed a hand on your chest and whispered, "We're okay now." Rosa looked up at the sky, seeing stars begin to twinkle as if someone had just flipped a switch. She turned to Liana, sitting by the window, drawing quietly, and softly asked, "Do you want to go out on the porch? I have an old blanket from when I was little. We can take it out there with Orion and watch the stars." Liana looked up. Didn't answer. But that gaze, once used to avoiding and panicking, now simply nodded gently. They spread the blanket over the worn wooden porch floor. Rosa lay on one side, Liana in the middle. Orion didn't wait to be called. He automatically settled at Liana's feet, resting his head on her lap as always. Orion's breath was steady. His fur rose and fell softly with each inhale, like a lullaby sung in the language of life. Liana brought a wordless comic book, her own drawings, each page a small window, opening onto gentle memories, slowly softening. She didn't read aloud, didn't show anyone. Just flipped the pages, then looked up at the sky, where constellations seemed to tell their own stories. After a while, Liana took Rosa's hand. She didn't squeeze hard. She didn't draw anything. She just traced a single word with the tip of her finger on her mother's palm. Stay. Rosa felt every stroke, every slow, deliberate movement, like the heartbeat of her daughter. No words, no tears needed, just enough peace to be felt. She didn't cry like when she first heard Liana laugh. She didn't squeeze her daughter's hand back. She simply nodded, as if she had been waiting to hear that word her whole life. Orion lifted his head and gently licked Liana's hand. Not too wet, not rushed. Then he rested his head back on her lap and let out a soft sigh, like a promise fulfilled. light, but enough to soothe a restless heart. That night they spoke little. The sky was full of stars, sparkling, vast, like a great embrace. The old blanket became shelter for 3 souls once torn apart by things no one dared name. Liana no longer feared the dark. Orion no longer needed to guard her, and Rosa, for the first time in years, didn't worry about waking her daughter with a breath too loud. They curled together beneath the blanket. On the porch, under a sky without a past, only the present. And that present was as beautiful as any ordinary thing people hope for but not everyone keeps. A porch, a dog, a silent touch, and a quiet star shining above, as if guarding the dreams of those who have walked through darkness. That afternoon, the air was cool. The sky was veiled with thin clouds softening the sunlight. A gentle breeze swept through the tall branches, shaking loose a few late-season leaves. Rosa took Liana and Orion to a small park on the edge of town, not crowded, quiet enough to feel safe. Liana sat beneath a large maple tree, her back resting against its sturdy trunk, arms wrapped around her familiar sketchbook. Orion lay close, head resting lightly on the grass, body turned slightly, one ear folded as if resting, but his tail still wagged gently from time to time. Liana said nothing. She simply watched quietly, sketching faint pencil lines on the page. A broken branch, Orion's shape, a few leaves she had gathered earlier. No voices interrupted. Only the wind, the cicadas' hum, and the steady breath of Orion beside her. Rosa sat not far away. She didn't disturb her daughter, only opened a book to read, and occasionally glanced up, her eyes soft as if guarding her child's silent dreams. From across the park came the sound of small footsteps running through the grass. A boy, about 7 years old, curly hair, bright eyes, and slightly worn sneakers, ran happily with his mother along the paved path. He suddenly stopped when he saw Orion. "Mom, look at that beautiful dog!" he exclaimed, eyes glued to Orion. The mother bent down, following her son's pointing finger. When she saw Liana sitting nearby, she slowly approached Rosa. "May my child come closer to play with the dog?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Rosa glanced at Liana. Liana stayed still, clutching her sketchbook, her eyes flickering slightly. Orion rose slowly, not barking, just watching the 2 strangers approaching, his tail wagging gently, a cautious greeting. Rosa said nothing. She simply placed a light hand on Liana's shoulder, a touch without urging or pressure, just enough to let her know her mother was there, right beside her. Liana looked at Orion. Orion didn't look back, but took a step forward, as if to say he wasn't worried. And Liana needn't be either. The small hand squeezed the leash lightly. For a few seconds, the whole park fell silent. Then Liana nodded. Slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. The mother smiled and held her son's hand as they walked closer. "Let's be gentle, okay? We don't want to scare our new friend," she said. The boy, Theo, squatted down in front of Orion. "Hi," he said, shy but sincere. "I'm Theo. Can I touch you?" Orion didn't move. He stepped forward, sniffed Theo's hand softly, then gave a quick lick. His tail wagged clearly now, steady, happy. Liana tilted her head, her grip on the sketchbook loosening. She looked at the boy. Then at Orion. She said nothing. But her hand flipped to a fresh page, quickly sketching 3 figures sitting close together, a small child, a dog, and someone with long hair. Rosa watched from afar. She didn't interrupt. She bit her lip to hold back tears. Orion stayed between the two children. His body formed a bridge, a soft cushion, as if he knew his role was to help little hearts find their way to each other, slowly and gently. And today, something that had never happened before finally came true. No trumpets, no fireworks, only soft laughter drifting beneath the trees, mixed with the light footsteps of small feet gliding across the grass. The green grass carpet stretched out beneath them, and a dog named Orion walked quietly alongside the healing journey, like a silent guardian of everyday miracles. Orion took a step toward Theo. He didn't rush, didn't bark loudly, just a soft bark, just enough to make the boy look up, eyes sparkling with delight. A greeting. Nothing more, nothing less, as if Orion was saying, "I'm here, I'm not dangerous. You can play if you want." Theo grinned wide. He sat down on the grass, hands behind him for support, leaning slightly forward. "Smart dog," he whispered. Liana stood behind, clutching her sketchbook. She looked at Orion, then at the boy. For a moment the breeze fluttered her skirt, and a few dry petals danced softly around her feet. Orion turned back to look at Liana. No bark, no step forward. He just waited, and Liana, for the first time on an afternoon with no pressure, lifted her foot. Step by step, very slow. But with each step, Rosa's eyes couldn't leave her daughter. Liana came closer, standing right beside Orion. Theo reached out his hand. Orion sniffed gently, then softly placed his paw into the small palm. Not too hard, not for long. Just a touch, a handshake between new friends. Neither said a word. Only the wind, the rustle of leaves, golden sunlight filtering through the branches, casting playful spots on the ground. "What's this dog's name?" Theo asked, turning to Liana. Liana didn't answer, but she opened her sketchbook and wrote a large word in pencil. "Orion." Theo looked at it, nodded approvingly. "Cool name." Suddenly Orion barked, louder this time, joyful, then spun around and ran toward the wide meadow. Theo shouted, running after him, "Wait for me!" Liana watched them go, then ran after, still holding her sketchbook, her loose hair flying behind her like a small kite, just freed from a long-held tether. The three of them stopped near a small sandy patch. Theo bent down and scribbled with a stick, a house, a tree, and 3 circles standing close together. Liana watched, then lowered herself too, adding a star above the house. Orion flopped down between the 2 children. Sand clung lightly to his back. His ears drooped, tongue lolling out, happy and content. After a while, Theo pulled a small ball from his pocket. "Does your dog know how to play fetch?" Orion sprang up. Theo tossed the ball. Orion ran like the wind, his paws touching the ground 3 times before he snatched the ball and raced back, tail wagging like a drumbeat. Theo laughed. Then Liana held out her hand. "Let me try." Her voice was very soft, but clear. Rosa sat a little ways off, behind a big tree. She didn't come closer, didn't interrupt. She just raised a hand to her mouth, covering a sob. It was the first time, in months since the court hearing, she'd heard her daughter laugh out loud. The ball rolled toward Liana. She caught it with both hands, eyes lighting up. "Go, Orion!" The whole park echoed with a joyful bark. Orion shot off like a streak of sunlight touching the earth, and Rosa, still sitting there, tears falling down her sleeve, didn't cry from sadness, didn't feel loss. She felt something else. Because in that moment she knew her daughter had truly touched something called normal. And that was a real miracle, born from a dog, a brave little heart, and a soft bark in a sunny afternoon. No dazzling glow, no fairy magic. Just a moment, warm enough, real enough, and deep enough to plant in a heart something fragile and strong all at once. Hope. As the sun began to dip low, casting a soft golden glow over the grass, Theo came running slowly toward Liana, hands hidden behind his back. He stopped in front of her, cheeks flushed as if he had just done something very important. Then he pressed a folded piece of paper into Liana's hand, edges slightly curled from sweat. On the paper was a crayon drawing, a chubby dog standing beneath a smiling sun and a bright blue ice cream cone. "Dog with sun and ice cream," Theo said, eyes never leaving Orion. "I think it's like today." Liana looked at the paper. No smile, no nod, but her eyes flickered softly, like a cool breeze brushing a corner of a heart long dry. Quietly, she opened her backpack and pulled out a smaller piece of paper, half a torn page from her sketchbook, carefully torn so the edges remained neat. With just a few black pencil strokes, she drew 3 figures, no faces, no details, but everyone could tell. Theo, Liana, and Orion, standing side by side, no one in between, no one walking away, simply there, together in the same place, as if it had always been that way. She said nothing, just handed the drawing to Theo, her hand trembling slightly but not pulling away. Theo took it, studied the picture for a long moment, then nodded, eyes wide. "I'll keep it. You draw really well." Rosa stood a few steps away, not intruding. She quietly watched the 2 children, one once silent from pain, the other too young to fully understand that silence, and felt her heart soften. Orion stood nearby, tail wagging gently, eyes looking up as if asking, "Is that okay now?" She bent down and stroked Orion's head, her hand gliding softly over his ear. A silent thank you. As the sun nearly set, the 3 left the park. Rosa held her daughter's hand. Orion walked beside them, not too close to trip, not too far to leave anyone behind. They walked slowly, steady steps, like walking a tightrope stretched between past and present, at the end of which hung something small, but more precious than anything else. Trust. No one spoke on the way home. But from Liana's relaxed shoulders, from Rosa's upward gaze, and from the way Orion occasionally glanced back to make sure they were still there, you could guess that something was beginning to bloom in their hearts, not forgetting, but the ability to keep moving forward, with a heart no longer tightly closed. And in that small drawing, now tucked safely in Theo's jacket pocket, was perhaps the first proof that, no matter how far the journey, through silence and brokenness, hearts can find each other again. Under the sun, beside a dog, amid new laughter just beginning to bloom. Early the next morning, while the mist still hovered thinly over the forest trails, Rosa stopped the car by a small dirt road north of town. Before them stood a red-roofed wooden house, quiet among the pines. The place was called the Little Classroom on the Hill, reserved for children who needed time to heal, not with lessons, but with listening. Orion stepped out first. Liana followed, clutching her backpack strap like a habit she hadn't yet shed. But this time, Liana's steps didn't slow. No calls, no reminders from Rosa. She knew exactly where she was going. Miss May stood by the door, wearing a soft, mint-green sweater, her hair neatly tied back. She always spoke slowly, gently, like the early spring breeze. She never pressed the children, never forced answers. To May, silence was also a form of conversation. Sometimes it held more meaning than any words. Today's class had only 6 children, scattered around a large oval wooden table. On the table lay scraps of paper, crayons, clay, and a tiny microphone, switched off, not recording. But to May, that little microphone was an invitation. If today you want to share something, do it your own way. Who wants to tell a story? May said softly. In any way you want. That's fine. Liana sat still for a moment. Her fingers fiddled with the edge of her backpack. Orion lay at her feet, resting his head on her leg, eyes half closed but ears alert. Then, very slowly, Liana unlocked her bag. She pulled out a sturdy-bound sketchbook. She held it close to her chest, like a piece of memory ripe enough to share. No one urged her. No one looked at her expectantly. But something in the air shifted, like light slowly breaking through thick clouds after a stormy night. Liana stood up. Orion stood too, but he only walked a few steps before sitting quietly in the middle of the class, like a silent guardian. Rosa sat near the window, holding her breath. She knew this was the first time since the accident that Liana had chosen to be heard. Liana placed the sketchbook on the table. She didn't open it immediately. Her eyes scanned the room, faces without judgment, without probing. May nodded gently, offering no pressure. Liana opened to the first page, an old drawing, still shaky lines, faded, messy colors, a crooked house with a roof nearly falling down. She turned to the next page, a dog standing in the rain, fur bristled, eyes bright. Orion. The third page, a girl standing alone in the woods, no one around. But in the distance, a speck of light approaching. Liana continued flipping through the pages, memories old and new blending together. Some drawings were just pencil strokes, others full of color. But every image held things words could never gather. Through each line, you could see a journey, from brokenness to healing. When Liana paused on the last page, Orion lifted his head. His eyes didn't look at the drawing, but at her, as if to say, yes, this is right. It was a drawing of Liana, Rosa, and Orion, standing side by side under a tree. Above, the sun peeking out, not blazing, just warm enough. Liana said nothing. She gently pushed the sketchbook toward the center of the table. She placed her hand on the microphone. It wasn't on. It made no sound. But that hand, steady and calm, was the truest voice of all. The room fell silent. No one broke the moment. May touched her hand to her heart, then smiled, a smile soft as spring breeze drifting past the doorway. And below, Orion curled up, his tail wagging softly, as if saying, she said softly, I have told my story. The rest, let the world listen. Liana stood before the class, her sketchbook held gently in her hands, no longer something to hide behind, but a place holding the pain once carried, now glowing with color and courage. She opened to the first page. A faint pencil line sketched a room with closed windows and rain slipping sideways down the glass. No people, no sounds, just silence. The next page showed Orion, standing in a courtyard blanketed with golden leaves. His eyes didn't look straight ahead, but seemed to watch something beyond the frame. Behind him was a small shadow, half hidden. Liana flipped through the pages faster now, each turn a fragment of memory, a quiet step forward in a long, silent journey. One new drawing, never before seen, showed a family of 3 standing side by side. Their faces were simple circles, hands clasped, with a dog standing between them. Behind, a cloudless blue sky and distant rustling trees. The next page showed a child standing behind a large dog, likely Orion, beneath a shaded canopy. Sunlight filtered through leaves, casting sparkling patches onto her shoulders. Both girl and dog faced away from the viewer, but their safety was unmistakable. The final page was the simplest, just a rough scrawl. I'm okay now. the ink still dark, the lines fresh, as if written that very morning. No one laughed, no one clapped, but the room warmed gently, deeply, like the sun breaking through after many cloudy winter days. Liana lifted her head. Her gaze rested on Orion, still lying quietly at her feet, head resting on his front paws, breathing steady. As always, Orion did nothing flashy. No need to, just presence. She turned back to the room. Her voice was soft but carried clearly. "This is Orion. He taught me that. You don't need to bark to protect." The class remained silent, but it was the silence of hearts fully listening. Miss May stepped forward, gently resting a hand on Liana's shoulder. No words, just a bowed head and eyes glistening. In that moment there were no teachers or students, only souls touched by truth and healing. Orion wagged his tail once more, as if marking the moment Liana had finished telling her story. No bark, no pleading eyes, just being there, at the right time, right place, long enough for trust to take root. Outside the classroom, new leaves swayed softly in the spring breeze. Above, the sky was clear, like the very first morning of a new life, where children not only heal, but learn to stand up and tell their own stories, alongside a German shepherd who has quietly walked beside them all along. At the end of class, Miss May smiled, waving gently like a breeze. "We'll go out to the garden now. Bring your paints and your free hearts." Liana followed the other children. No need to hold anyone's hand. No clutching her sketchbook like she used to. Orion walked right beside her. No leash needed. Just a natural companionship, like the midday light softly brushing the grass or a gentle breath. The small garden stretched out beneath the hill. A few wooden benches were placed around the largest tree, its shade casting cool patches on the sun-speckled grass. The children scattered, each choosing a corner, each carrying something unspoken inside, searching for a way to turn it into color. Orion didn't wait for a signal. He settled himself beneath the tree, curling up with eyes half closed. His ears twitched slightly, as if ready to catch the smallest movement from the girl beside him. Liana sat down nearby. No glancing around, no overthinking. She placed a blank sheet on her lap, opened her box of crayons, and began to draw. The first strokes were a small porch, gently slanted, with a window wide open to catch the breeze. Then a low wooden fence, and beyond it, the figure of a child sitting. No face visible, just a round shape, holding a pencil, eyes focused on the paper. And next to her, Orion. Painted in muted colors, calm and quiet, but radiating warmth in every soft curve of his resting form. His tail curled gently to the side, ears folded down, the expression of a dog doing nothing but simply being there. In the corner of the drawing, Liana carefully wrote, "Family is where a heart knows how to stay." No one taught her that phrase. She hadn't heard it anywhere. It was something she felt from Rosa's eyes every night by her bedside, from Miss May's hand resting on her shoulder when she trembled, and from the way Orion never stepped ahead, never left her behind. When she finished, Liana put down her crayon and leaned back against the tree trunk. Orion lifted his head, gently resting it on her hand. No bark, no movement, just lying there, as if understanding that this story had found the right ending. In the slanting sunlight filtering through the leaves, the drawing lay open on the girl's lap. The scene in the picture mirrored by the world outside. And if someone stood watching from afar, they'd see. Not all wounds leave scars. Some wounds, in the end, simply open a path for light to come in. And Orion, just like always, would lie quietly there, guarding that light, until the day she no longer needed him.